A knock on the staircase railing, the deafening echo of an empty house, and a scream piercing the air. It was a mother's scream, which still echoes in the mind of everyone who has heard the story. On that ill-fated evening, life in the Meier home was divided into a before and an after. Megan, a smiling and shy girl who was only 3 weeks away from her 14th birthday, would never leave her room again. Her parents were busy minding their own business, discussing something in the kitchen while tragedy unfolded upstairs. All it took was a few cold, thoughtful sentences, written in the hand of someone they trusted. Behind the screen lurked a shadow, without a face, without a name, but with one intention: to destroy lives. They would later say it was a joke, that no one imagined it would go this far. But then, who will explain the tears on the cheeks of the girl who at the last moment changed her mind about dying, but could not change anything? The law enforcement authorities stubbornly refused to disclose the names of the suspects and kept the details of the investigation in strict secrecy. Nevertheless, curious journalists managed to get to the truth and revealed to the public who was behind the tragedy that took the life of 13-year-old Megan Meier. Soon, the addresses and phone numbers of Lori Drew and her daughter Sarah surfaced online. Angry residents, having learned the bitter truth, were not going to limit themselves to condemnation. They seriously intended to raze the Drew family home to the ground. The situation heated up to the limit, and even the Meiers, who had lost their daughter, tried to contain the people's anger. Megan Meier's story shocked the public. Under pressure from public opinion, and thanks to the persistence of the Meier family, a new law was passed in 2009 to ban online stalking and harassment. This law, called the Megan Meier Act, focused specifically on cases of adults bullying minors. Although the official justice failed to punish Lori Drew, the people sentenced her themselves. Public censure and boycott descended upon her, and her family became isolated. A house once full of life was now a symbol of how violent games on the internet can lead to tragedy, the echoes of which can still be heard today. Under the pressure of public scorn, Lori Drew had to quit her job. She could no longer bear the hostile stares of her co-workers. Hiding from threats, she decided to move, carefully disguising her new location. But even this was not enough. Her life hung in the balance because the revenge of angry citizens could take the harshest forms. Even Sarah, her daughter, had to change her name and still lives in constant fear. This whole nightmare also affected the Meier family. Christine could not forgive herself for not keeping her daughter safe, and Ronald was unable to cope with the grief. Their marriage collapsed. Christine and her youngest daughter Allison moved to another city, and Ronald, lost and alone, makes ends meet and struggles with depression with the help of psychologists. His condition remains extremely unstable. In an interview, Christina recalled how on the day of Megan's death, she had to take off her hated braces. She had dreamed about it for years, but refused to go with her mother at that moment. Perhaps if she had been able to talk it out or just waited out one more day, things might have turned out differently. But her decision was final. What led to such a tragic outcome? What could a young girl feel, caught in the grip of cruelty, which came not from the outside, but penetrated into her life through the screen? On the surface, everything seemed ordinary: school, friends, dreams, small teenage worries. But behind that ordinariness was a slowly unfolding nightmare. Social media, where there should have been a place of joy and community, became a space full of ridicule and humiliation for Megan. Megan's days became filled with anxiety and despair, which at first looked like simple teenage sadness, but then turned into hopelessness. A sense of loneliness overwhelmed her when even home was no longer a place of refuge from her pain. But within this tangle of secrets and lies something more sinister, a skillfully woven web that Megan failed to recognize. And now, we come to the sinister truth behind the impassioned nickname Josh Evans. Let's find out who was behind this account, and what were the intentions of those who pulled the strings, playing with the fate of a 13-year-old girl who had no idea of the betrayal. Megan Taylor Meier was born on November 6, 1992, in the quiet town of O'Fallon, Missouri. At first glance, her life could be as quiet and measured as the town itself, but from an early age, the first cracks in her destiny began to show. She was the first child in the family of Christina and Ronald Meier, And from the very beginning, her parents noticed something special in their daughter, which became more and more disturbing with each passing year. Already in elementary school, Megan could not fit into the usual framework. Her attention was scattered, she often could not concentrate, and suddenly broke into a screaming right in the classroom. This behavior did not fit the standards, and in the eyes of her peers, she quickly became strange and abnormal. As if caught in the crosshairs, the girl inevitably became an object of ridicule and humiliation. Behind her back whispered, and in the face threw hurtful nicknames that cut her fragile soul. Crazy, monster. These labels accompanied her everywhere, turning every day at school into an endless struggle. Studying was no relief either. If a subject didn't spark Megan's interest, her mind instantly shifted to other, more colorful and appealing thoughts. She tried desperately to connect with others, to become her own person, but every time she tried, she failed. Her playfulness and desire to see others happy often made her the target of cruel jokes. Those she tried to make laugh and win their approval only reinforced her isolation in return. As time went on, the situation got worse. In adolescence, when peer cruelty escalated, Megan found herself in the midst of bullying that was destroying her from the inside out. She was teased for everything from her appearance to the way she spoke. She saw only flaws in herself, and her self-esteem plummeted rapidly. For a shy girl who had always dreamed of acceptance and love, these taunts became a nightmare. Days turned into a series of humiliation and suffering. At the age of 11, driven to despair, Megan began to seriously consider suicide. Fortunately, at this point, she decided to confide in her mother, and she immediately sought help from specialists. The diagnosis sounded like a verdict: attention deficit disorder, deep depression caused by constant pressure and lack of support. Treatment helped ease Megan's suffering a little and gave her family the tools to support her, but the wounds caused by years of abuse could not fully heal. The pain inside her continued to smolder despite the best efforts of her loved ones. It was the story of a girl who dreamed of being accepted, but found herself alone with the cruelty of the world around her. Megan tried her best to survive the nightmare, but at every turn she met only cold indifference and contempt. She was left with only one question: how much longer could she take it? The bullying that Megan endured at school was not going to let up, despite her family's best efforts. It seemed like every new day was a challenge for this girl. But one day, in 2004, she had an unexpected change in her life. A new family moved into the neighborhood. With this move, Megan found not only a new neighbor, but also, as it seemed to her, the only real friend, a girl named Sarah Drew. Sarah, like Megan, faced the scorn of those around her. Being overweight made her an easy target for ridicule, and in that they were alike. Two girls labeled by society as different. Together, they felt less alone. Their friendship quickly developed into a close bond in which both found support and comfort. As teenagers should, they fought often, but reconciled even more quickly, as if nothing had happened. This bond proved to be a salvation for both, though it carried ominous shadows. Megan and Sarah's families also grew closer. Dinners, holidays together, and frequent visits to each other became routine. Megan cherished her hopes for a fresh start. The summer before high school started was a time of hope and faith in change for her. She shared her expectations with her mother and Sarah, imagining how things would change for the better. Megan was determined that she would no longer be that weird girl that everyone made fun of. She believed she had grown up and would finally be able to join the circle of popular girls she dreamed of being friends with. But the reality was much harsher. Already in the first weeks of the new school year, Megan again became a target for cruel ridicule. School turned out to be the same battlefield, only with new forms of humiliation. Classmates this time focused their anger on her appearance. Overweight and braces became an inexhaustible source of mockery for them. Every lunch period was a torture for Megan, with the girls in her class making cow-like sounds, accompanied by sarcastic comments. Cruel words, jokes, and bullying accompanied her everywhere. Every day began and ended in tears, and Megan's mood swung from hope to utter despair. She began to see school as a cage with no way out. At the end of the school year, Megan desperately told her parents that she didn't want to go back. Seeing the rapid deterioration of her mental state, her parents decided that the solution would be a new school, a closed Christian institution where strict order and discipline reigned. The new school was known for its impeccable reputation. It was attended by children from religious and intelligent families. Her parents believed that in this safe environment, their daughter would find peace and relief from the bullying that plagued her. But sometimes, when you try to run away from monsters, they only follow you, changing masks and approaches. Megan's well-intentioned parents didn't know that this new phase could also lead to even more horrifying consequences. The summer of 2006 was a time of hope and change for the Meier family. Megan's parents signed documents to transfer their daughter to a new Christian school, where they believed the girl would finally find peace of mind and make friends. And at first glance, their expectations were met. In this educational institution, 13-year-old Megan as if breathed a breath of fresh air. No one was laughing behind her back or whispering in the hallways. On the contrary, from the very first day, she was surrounded by new classmates, sincerely interested in her, asking questions, joking. In just a few months, Megan not only made friends, but also joined the school volleyball team. She felt happy for the first time in a long time, as if the black streak in her life was finally over. However, with new friends came new changes. Megan began to distance herself from Sarah Drew, the friend who had been her only support for a long time. Now her days were occupied with socializing with new acquaintances, and Sarah gradually moved to the background. Meanwhile, a new craze was taking over the teenage world, the social networking site MySpace. For Megan, this became a real challenge. All of her new company already had accounts on this network, discussing the latest posts and sharing memes. When friends suggested that Megan add them as friends, she suddenly realized that she herself was not yet registered. How to explain to these cool guys that she still didn't have a profile? That question kept her in suspense. That same evening, Megan resolutely approached her parents. Why does everyone else have one and I don't? How am I any worse than anyone else? Her parents realized that isolation from her peers could drive their daughter back into depression. So after discussion, they agreed, but on their terms. Christina, always cautious and anxious, insisted on complete control. The password to the page was kept only with her and Ronald. Every time Megan wanted to log into her profile, she had to ask her parents for the password. Tight control was the price of admission to this new virtual world. Christina prepared thoroughly before allowing her daughter to enter the online space. She told Megan about all sorts of dangers, scams, viruses, fake profiles. The internet, in her opinion, was full of hidden threats. Behind every cute photo, there could be anyone hiding, she insisted. But to Megan, these cautions only sounded like boring stories. She needed one thing, to keep up with her new friends and be on topic. Her world was finally starting to take on bright colors, but no one guessed that shadows had begun to thicken where she least expected. The delicate balance between the desire to be accepted and the dangers of the new virtual world began to be disturbed. What lurked behind innocent requests to add friends and innocuous likes? Megan was soon to learn that even in the seemingly safest of places, real monsters lurked. Megan had sincerely promised her mother that she would be as careful as possible. Moreover, she herself had suggested that her mother could monitor all her messages to make sure nothing dangerous was going on. The most important condition was that Christina would decide who could be added as friends and who could not. These words reassured the worried mother. That evening, Megan anxiously created her first MySpace account. Shortly after setting up her profile, a request to be added as a friend popped up on the screen. It was a handsome young man named Josh Evans, 16, with a charming smile in his picture. In his profile, he indicated that he was moving to the city where Megan lived soon and wanted to meet new people beforehand. His first message was simple, but evoked a wave of emotion from Megan. "You're really cute." Megan showed her mother's profile with bated breath. Christina was wary of the stranger at first, but under the pressure of her daughter begging and beaming with happiness, she finally agreed. Megan was in seventh heaven. Megan had never attracted the attention of guys up until that point, and now she was literally glowing with joy. This perfect guy was coming into her life more and more each day. He told her about his hobbies: playing guitar and drums, his passion for rock and roll. And then he shared his difficult story. At the age of 7, his father left the family, and his mom had to struggle to provide for them. Megan was touched by this. She felt she had found someone who understood her, even if they had never met in reality. For her, Josh was like a prince from a dream. They spent hours texting each other, sharing their thoughts and experiences. Josh skillfully boosted her self-esteem, telling her she was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. It made Megan soar above the ground, forgetting about her complexes and the ridicule she had put up with for years. She couldn't wait for the school day to end so she could go home and get online as soon as possible, because the man who had given her so much happiness was waiting for her there. But behind this perfect scenario was a dark shadow that neither Megan nor her parents could see. A seemingly ordinary teenage romance began to turn into something sinister. Josh was becoming Megan's only source of joy, her refuge. She trusted him with all her secrets, while this prince masterfully manipulated her emotions, tailoring every message to maximize her trust. Something evil was already looming over the naive girl, but she was too blinded by the illusion of happiness to notice. Everything looked fine, but something unsettling was beginning to seep through that illusory peace. Josh, who had become practically everything to Megan, continued to avoid actually meeting her. Months of communication, and he'd never once offered to see her in person. He claimed he was homeschooled and therefore not attending school. Video calls? No. He doesn't have a good camera. Phone calls? No way. He just doesn't have a phone at home, he said. Walking? He explained it this way. He's too embarrassed to go out with a pretty and sweet girl like Megan. Any reasonable mother would have suspected something wrong, and Christina Meier was no exception. But seeing how happy her daughter was, how her depressed mood was replaced by joy, she turned a blind eye to these obvious oddities. Christine comforted herself with the fact that Josh showed no warning signs. He didn't ask for private meetings, didn't demand candid photos, and communicated in a sweet and friendly manner. It all seemed like a harmless teenage hobby, and the mother let her daughter enjoy the new experience, believing there was no real threat here. Megan's father, Ronald, also saw that their daughter's life was starting to get better. The girl, who had previously been oppressed by ridicule and loneliness, now felt confident at school, enjoyed her new friends, and even improved her grades. By mid-October 2006, Megan was literally floating on wings. She was preparing for her 14th birthday, and for the first time in her life, she was sure that the party would be a success. Her parents had carefully planned a party that would bring together all of her new friends. It meant everything to Megan. For the first time, she could invite someone from school instead of settling for just boring family gatherings. This was her chance to prove that she was no longer the weird girl she'd always been thought of as. Everything was working out perfectly. On October 16, 2006, Megan was in a particularly rosy mood. She'd handed out invitation cards to her classmates at school, imagining how much fun it would be. But one figure from the past wasn't among the invitees, Sarah Drew, the same girl who had once been her best friend. Their paths had diverged, and now Megan didn't feel the need to keep in touch with those left behind. After all, now she had new friends, new goals, and a new life where everything seemed to be finally going right. But behind that bright facade, a dark shadow was already lurking. Megan hadn't yet realized that this Josh Evans and his kind words hid something creepy. Every day, the noose skillfully woven in the online world tightened tighter and tighter. When Megan got home, there was only one idea on her mind: inviting Josh to the upcoming party. She was sure that this mysterious guy who was giving her so much attention wouldn't be able to refuse a live meeting. As soon as the door slammed shut behind her mother and younger sister, Megan rushed to the computer. Her mind was spinning with rainbow thoughts of what a wonderful time they would have. But everything changed in an instant. As soon as she logged into her account, Megan noticed a message from Josh. It was nothing like his earlier gentle words. "I'm not sure I want to be friends with you. People say you don't like your friends." The words stabbed like a cold knife in the back. Where had that come from? Who could have vilified her like that? Doubt and anxiety replaced joy in a flash. No sooner had she recovered from the shock than a flood of new messages descended upon her. Josh, that seemingly perfect boyfriend, had suddenly turned into a cruel taunter. He posted her private messages that she had trusted only to him, and those messages were immediately shared with all of her former classmates. Megan felt the world crumbling around her again. Those who had once bullied her at school were now gathered in one virtual place like a pack of hungry wolves. The comments came one after another. "Fatty! No one wants you!" Her heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was about to jump out of her chest. When Christina got home, she immediately heard crying. Megan was sitting in front of the monitor, drowning in tears. "Mom, they're all texting me nasty things. It's just awful!" Through sobs cried the girl. But Christina was already on the verge. She repeatedly warned her daughter to turn off the computer and stop this madness, but Megan did not listen. Seeing that the situation was getting out of control, her mother kicked her out of the room with harsh words and hurried to figure out what was going on. What she saw struck her to the core. Her daughter was desperately trying to argue with her abusers, responding to their vicious attacks. "You're my mom! At least you should be on my side!" Megan cried out in despair as her mother began to rebuke her for her carelessness and weakness. The girl, unable to withstand the pressure, rushed upstairs to her room, slamming the door with such force that a vibration rippled through the house. Megan was in a state of hysteria. The invisible monsters lurking behind the computer screens had caught up with her in her own sanctuary. These friends had turned out to be monsters, and now even her own home didn't seem like a safe place to her. Megan ran up the stairs, nearly colliding with her father. Ronald, noticing her crying face, tried to find out what was wrong. "They're writing horrible things about me, Daddy," was all she squeezed out. He, not realizing the depth of her distress, tried to calm his daughter by suggesting that she ignore her abusers. But Megan said nothing and ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. Usually at times like this, Christina would immediately follow her daughter to calm her down. But this time, something was different. Too much irritation had built up, and instead of supporting Megan, she decided to give her time to cool down. Ronald, not giving what was happening any serious thought, went into the kitchen. He and Christina began cooking dinner, discussing how difficult it was to raise children in a world full of digital threats. About 20 minutes passed. Suddenly, Christina froze, interrupting the conversation. An icy feeling swept over her inside that defied logic. Something terrible had happened. Without a word, she rushed upstairs to her daughter's room. This inexplicable impulse, like a premonition, drove her forward. Ronald, before he could even comprehend her behavior, heard a heart-rending cry from somewhere above, which made his heart ache. He rushed upstairs, where he found Christine, distraught with terror, in the hallway in front of the door to Megan's room. Once inside, he saw his daughter, her body hanging in a built-in closet, tied to a bar. In a panic, Ronald tried to pull her down, tearing the closet to shreds as if he could bring her back to life by sheer force of will. When her body was on the floor, he desperately began CPR, hoping a miracle would happen after all. Megan's tears, already motionless, glistened on her cheeks, a mute testament to her final pain. Megan Meier didn't live to see her 14th birthday for just 3 weeks. At the hospital, the doctors only confirmed the worst. When Ronald returned home, in a fit of grief and despair, he decided to log into her MySpace account. What he saw there shocked him. The last message was from Josh. "Everyone in town knows what you're really like. No one wants you. You're a pathetic person, and everyone hates you. The world would be a better place without people like you." Megan replied to him, "People like you are the reason people like you could die." Ronald and Christina immediately tried to contact Josh, but his page had disappeared. The mysterious friend had vanished into digital space as if he never existed. The next day, news of the tragedy spread throughout the school, and the very kids who had insulted her online yesterday suddenly turned into sympathizers. Messages full of regret and condolences poured into the Meier family, but it didn't matter to them anymore. They were broken, and the only thing that occupied their minds now was to find answers to the agonizing questions. Who was behind Josh's mask? And why had this nightmare become reality? Christina and Ronald, who had lost all hope, went to the police trying to find some answers. They passed on all the messages from the mysterious Josh Evans, hoping the investigation would lead them to the man who drove their daughter to despair. But the reality was much colder. The cops just threw up their hands, saying that online bullying and wishing death did not fall under the legal definition of a crime. However, it wasn't just this response that was shocking. It turned out that Josh Evans didn't exist at all. The profile was a fake, created for the sole purpose of trapping Megan. The investigation stalled, as if the intruder had vanished, leaving only a trail of pain and grief. Some time passed, and overcome with their pain, Christina and Ronald decided to visit Drew's family to tell Sarah, Megan's former best friend, about the tragedy in person. The adults spoke quietly, holding back tears as they shared memories of the girls' friendship. "Megan always spoke warmly of you," Christina said, feeling the words stick in her throat. Lori Drew, Sarah's mother, offered heartfelt condolences, seemingly genuinely sharing their grief. The families said their goodbyes, but a strange tension hung in the air. 6 weeks later, the Meiers received an unexpected phone call. A woman from their neighborhood, whom they hardly knew, said she had information about their daughter's death. Her daughter, Michelle, told her the gruesome truth. Josh Evans was a fictional character created by the neighbors. Lori Drew, the same woman who comforted them at the funeral, along with her daughter Sarah and a 19-year-old girl named Ashley Grills, created this fake profile. And their goal wasn't just cruel, it was sinister. They wanted to taunt Megan, to watch her break down. Sarah bragged about this prank to Michelle, unaware of how it would turn out. When word got out about Megan's death, Lori Drew called Michelle and ordered her to keep quiet. "Shut your mouth or you'll be sorry," were her words. For Christine and Ronald, this blow was like a dagger in the back. Those who had seemed friends, those who had stood by their side at the funeral, those who had known their daughter since childhood, were the ones who had pushed her into the abyss. Lori Drew, a mature, judicious woman, a mother who was involved on more than one occasion. How could she use her power and experience to ruin the life of a 13-year-old girl? This woman built Megan's trust and then destroyed her self-esteem in cold blood, leading to tragedy. Megan had spent time with Sarah and her family on more than one occasion, going on vacations with them. The Drews were aware of her depression, of the girl's fragile emotional state. Lori always seemed genuinely interested in her health, meeting Christina at the store or on the street. And behind her back, she wove her sinister web to strike at just the right moment. "I wish you a shitty ending to your worthless life." When the truth came to the surface, Drew's family didn't know how to deal with the wave of hate and judgment. They desperately tried to make amends by visiting Christina and Ronald, but Megan's grief-stricken parents wouldn't even let them on their doorstep. In Christina and Ronald's eyes, the Drews were no longer just neighbors. They were the epitome of betrayal. The Meiers' house fell into a heavy silence, where pain, anger, and despair mingled. They could find no peace knowing that the men who had destroyed their family were still at large. Meanwhile, the police and FBI continued to investigate, but state laws were powerless over Lori Drew's actions. Technically, she had not broken the law. Cyberbullying was not yet clearly defined in the legal statutes. Lori Drew, feeling the ground slipping away from under her feet, began to defend herself, blaming it on 19-year-old Ashley Grills, claiming that she was the inspiration for the fake account. Lori tried to make herself look like a victim of manipulation, pointing to Ashley as the sole culprit. But Ashley proved to be less than cold-blooded. Consumed with guilt, she couldn't handle the psychological pressure and sought counseling. In the end, she agreed to testify against Lori in exchange for exemption from prosecution. When the case went to trial, the Meier couple waited for justice, but received only a new blow. The court refused to press criminal charges against Lori Drew. All Christina and Ronald were offered was an administrative action that could have resulted in fines and community service. How could their daughter's life be valued with such paltry payback? Shocked but not broken, the Meiers decided to follow through. They launched a campaign to change federal law, demanding that cyberbullying be criminalized. In 2008, their efforts were successful. Cyberbullying was added to the U.S. Criminal Code. Lori Drew was brought back to justice, and a jury unanimously found her guilty of Megan Meier's death. But hopes for justice were dashed when a federal court overturned the verdict, citing a lack of a crime. Lori Drew remained free, but the verdict sparked a wave of outrage across the country. Christina Meier recalls that on the day her daughter decided to leave for good, Megan had one cherished wish: to get rid of the braces, which she hated with all her soul. This moment was for her a symbol of the beginning of a new life, free from complexes and ridicule. She had dreamed about it for years, but when the day of long-awaited release came, Megan suddenly refused to go to the orthodontist. Something heavy and dark was already hanging over her mind, and her mother's words about getting rid of her discomfort soon went unheard. That day, the clouds of doubt and pain finally clouded her mind. Perhaps if she had chosen to talk to her family or simply wait out the storm, tragedy might have been avoided. But Megan had made her choice to leave. However, Megan was not the only one who made that fateful decision. She did what she did, Christina says, but it was like someone handed her a loaded revolver and watched her pull the trigger. These words are filled with bitterness and resentment, because Megan didn't just leave on her own. She was forced into it, purposefully destroying her fragile psyche. After the death of her daughter, Christina, struggling with despair, did not shut herself in, but channeled her pain into concrete actions. She started the Megan Meier Foundation with the goal of preventing and combating cyberbullying. "I can't bring my daughter back, but if I can save even one life, Megan didn't die in vain," Christina says firmly. The foundation has become a pillar and beacon for those who feel trapped in digital abuse. Christina believes that by turning her tragedy into a mission, she can shed light on the dire consequences of cyberbullying and protect those who can still be saved. Eddie Pointer didn't know that his kindness would become his sentence. When he opened the door to that same boy and his girlfriend, it never occurred to him that with them, he was letting death into his home. The house he once thought of as his sanctuary would soon become the stage for a brutal massacre. It began with a small thing, a friendly gesture, an offer to spend the night. But there was already a strange fire in his guest's eyes that Eddie noticed too late. During the night, as silence engulfed the house, there were thuds in his bedroom. It turned out that inviting these two men into the house wasn't just a mistake. It was a deadly miscalculation. When they burst into the room, their faces were as cold as masks. One swift stab of the knife and blood ran across the floor, staining everything a horrible red. Eddie didn't have time to realize what was happening. The flames of the fire they had set seemed ready to wipe out everything he loved. The house burned to the ground, and with it the last traces of his life disappeared, leaving only the charred skeleton of the building. The police found only ashes and blood. No one could explain how such simple kindness could turn into a nightmare, and what made a young couple, seemingly harmless, turn into cold-blooded killers. This story was just beginning, and its ending promised to be even more gruesome. On April 16th, Miami law enforcement officials contacted detectives and said they had arrested Dale. The criminal had been apprehended in a stolen car. Detectives also found it odd that his girlfriend Jennifer was trying to exonerate herself of both crimes when apprehended, doing so ineptly and too conspicuously. The girl claimed that everything happened without her participation, which aroused even more suspicion. Against this background, it seemed especially strange that she did not try to escape from Dale and go to the police immediately after the first murder, but continued to obediently follow the criminal. When asked about it, she referred to fright and shock, but her explanations sounded unconvincing. Investigators believed she was lying and complicit in the crimes, as she had ample opportunity to escape and call for help. Interestingly, the perpetrators were caught on several city surveillance tapes where they looked perfectly calm, like a couple in love. Dale clearly did not force the girl to follow him. She did everything voluntarily. According to the suspect, after escaping from Blaine's home, they stayed in Indiana at the home of an acquaintance of Dale's. The perpetrator was about to go on the run and ordered Jennifer to return home. He believed she would not face jail time since she had not committed the crime. He promised to get in touch with her later. However, after Jennifer's confession, she was charged with 2 counts of murder, robbery, and arson, as well as tampering with physical evidence. Now investigators were focused on finding Dale. The only thing the girl knew was that he had always dreamed of traveling to Miami, so he was probably headed toward Florida. Louisville law enforcement officials contacted the Miami Police Department, informing them that a dangerous criminal was heading in their direction and already had an arrest warrant out for him. Police were especially concerned that he might kill someone else. The dangerous criminal had been on the loose for over 2 weeks and had never been located based on Jennifer's testimony. She may have lied on purpose, misleading the police and leading them down a false trail. In fact, the perpetrator who brutalized the 2 men could have been anywhere. Of course, he was considered particularly dangerous because he was willing to do anything to stay free. But before we delve into the complex and grim events, let's go back to the beginning of this story. To understand how Jennifer and Dale found themselves at the center of this tragedy, it's important to learn who they are, how their fates are connected, and what brought them to this point. How did their lives turn out before they became involved in this horrific event? How did they meet, and what ties their fates together? Understanding their pasts will help us better understand what happened and why their paths crossed in such a dramatic way. Let's take a look at how their story began, what led them to this pivotal moment, and how it all started. The time was approaching midnight, and the tranquility of Louisville, Kentucky was shattered by an alarm call. On March 24, 2006, a panicked area resident called emergency services reporting a fire on Harlan Avenue. Flames quickly engulfed the wooden house, she said, and rescuers immediately rushed to the scene. Neighbors watching the raging fire could only pray that firefighters arrived in time to prevent the flames from spreading to their own homes. Firefighters faced the fury of the elements, and their efforts to extinguish the fire took nearly 45 minutes. When the flames were suppressed, experts arrived on the scene to determine the cause of the fire. But what they found was far more gruesome than just faulty wiring or a forgotten cigarette. A body was discovered inside the building, forcing forensics and detectives to be called in to investigate further. By that point, the house was almost completely destroyed. Everything inside was covered in smoke, but it was already breathable, and police officers got to work. In the bedroom, they found the victim's body lying face up. His condition was so terrible that it was impossible to determine his sex without an expert examination. However, one thing was immediately obvious. The death was not accidental. The bloodily mutilated knife handle found in the body testified to extraordinary cruelty. Stabbing a knife into a man's face took considerable effort and reflected a special degree of violence. This case has become exceptional in the practice of forensics, confirming that there was a murder here. The fire that started exactly in the bedroom where the body was found was clearly part of the perpetrator's plan to destroy all evidence. This approach made it difficult to identify the victim. Documents and photographs that could have helped in identification were burned in the fire. Detectives tried to find something useful in the mailbox, but it was empty. Even from the victim's remaining belongings, it was difficult to determine her identity or gender. The charred remains in the body were prepared for transportation to the lab. The medical examiner, removing a knife from the victim's face, discovered that it was not a specialized combat tool, but an ordinary kitchen knife, probably taken directly from the victim's kitchen. This immediately ruled out a burglary or robbery gone wrong. Everything indicated that the crime was committed in a state of extreme rage, an act of jealousy or revenge. The absence of signs of forced entry confirmed that the perpetrator knew the victim. Shortly after the incident, police began interviewing neighbors and witnesses. By the time firefighters arrived, many residents had come outside to see what was going on. Among them was Daryl Ben, who was standing next to the woman who called emergency services. Daryl was clearly connected to the house, and when asked about possible occupants, he did not hesitate to give the name of his tenant, 40-year-old Eddie Pointer. It was ascertained that the deceased was a native of the Catholic community of Edmonton, Kentucky. He was previously married and had a daughter, but after his divorce, he decided to make a change and moved to Louisville in the late 90s. Eddie was eager to find a job, build a career, and possibly start a new life. Despite an initial warm welcome from the local community, adjusting to his new life was difficult for him, leading to his drinking problems. Despite the difficulties, Eddie Pointer remained a calm and polite man who was genuinely eager to get his life together. Life in Edmonton with addiction was difficult, but after moving to Louisville where he found a job and resolved to take control of himself, Eddie felt he was finding a path to recovery. He began attending AA meetings where he found support and new friends, which gave him hope for a better future. When it became necessary to find a new place to live, Eddie met Daryl Ben. This introduction proved to be a good time. Eddie was on the road to stability, and Daryl, as a landlord, was happy with the new tenant. Eddie had been alcohol-free for several months at this point, and he was eager to settle into his new accommodation as he continued to build his life. He quickly fitted into the local community and did not cause any problems. However, this peace of mind did not last long, only 8 months. 40-year-old Eddie was found dead in a burned-out house with a knife stabbed into his face up to the hilt. The scale of the destruction was so great that it took a long time to uncover evidence. It was only after a thorough examination of the scene that forensic investigators came across a partially burned notebook with several entries left in it, including Jennifer Smith's name. However, the phone number had been destroyed. Jennifer Smith's name was not unique, which complicated the search. Detectives had to check every woman with that name in Louisville. In the initial stages of the investigation, there was no evidence of the deceased's relationship with women or any connection to that name. Since almost everything was burned in the fire, no fingerprints or other evidence could be found, not even on the handle of the knife. All that remained were vague footprints and riddles that demanded to be solved. Investigators immediately began checking Eddie's inner circle and soon found Jennifer Smith, whose name was listed in his notebook. However, the suggestion that there might have been a relationship between Eddie and Jennifer seemed unlikely due to the significant age difference, as much as 20 years. From the beginning, the case seemed strange. When investigators tried to contact Jennifer, it turned out that she was out of town, which complicated the situation. Meanwhile, Eddie's loved ones were notified and were tasked with providing information about his entourage, which was crucial for the investigation to continue. However, the information available was not enough. This tragic news came as a great shock to Eddie's parents. His mother could not believe that her kind and calm son could get involved with dangerous people. Eddie did not suffer from mental illness and had no problems with the law. His mother mentioned that Eddie had many friends, including those in the AA community. This community may have held a clue, as the crime may have been related to some sort of conflict or love affair. However, further examination of Eddie's friends showed that they did not fit the image of violent criminals. They were all positive and supportive people like Eddie himself. None of them looked capable of such violence. At this time, Eddie's body was on the medical examiner's table. The specialist found numerous stab wounds on the deceased's face and body. Since the body was severely burned, counting the wounds was difficult. However, it was clear that the crime had been committed with extreme brutality. Eddie had been stabbed dozens of times, mostly in the upper torso and neck. The cuts were especially numerous on his hands, indicating a prolonged and fierce struggle for life. From the analysis of the burns, it was clear that the fire started directly around the body, or Eddie was set on fire after his death. This indicated that the perpetrator's intention was not just to destroy the victim, but to completely erase all possible evidence and traces. The local community was deeply disturbed as the victim lived in one of the safest neighborhoods in the city, populated by families with children who were now afraid to go outside. Residents urged police to increase security measures as rumors of the tragic death quickly spread and caused fear. Immediately after the discovery of the body, Eddie's acquaintances, shocked by his brutal death, began contacting the police station, hoping to help find the culprit. Despite their eagerness, none of the witnesses were able to provide useful information about possible motives or suspects. Eddie did not appear to be a man capable of being a victim of such violence, and at first glance had no enemies. This changed when the police received a call from Harry Perry, the dead man's best friend. He reported that in the last months of his life, Eddie had frequented small bars in downtown Louisville. Although Eddie himself had quit drinking, he continued to meet with friends at these establishments to keep in touch and have company. Harry added that Eddie was not in a romantic relationship at the time of his death, but had an extensive circle of close friends. Although he could not point to a specific suspect, Harry spoke about a person who could help in the investigation, an elderly man named Blaine Tucker. Despite the 30-year age difference, Tucker and Eddie had quickly become close friends, as they both worked in restaurants. Harry emphasized that the police should contact Tucker, who was one of Eddie's closest friends, for valuable information. However, Harry did not have Tucker's contact information, and he found it difficult to provide an exact address. He promised to check with Eddie's other friends to find out where Blaine Tucker was now. At that point, Blaine Tucker's whereabouts remained unknown, complicating the investigation. Detectives began by finding out what his job was. It turned out that Tucker was a cook at a family restaurant and worked part-time for a catering company. He was described as having a temper, but was quick to bounce back and friendly. His colleagues spoke of him only positively, emphasizing his diligence and professionalism. Tucker was known for his punctuality. He came to work first at 4 a.m. and immediately started preparing the kitchen. After the tragic events of the fire, Tucker suddenly disappeared and did not show up for work. Colleagues, concerned about his absence, were unable to reach him by phone, which seemed highly unusual for a man with an impeccable reputation and a strict work schedule. At first, they thought he had a valid excuse for his absence, but suspicions were heightened when he failed to show up at the restaurant the next day as well. This led co-workers to suspect that something serious had happened. When detectives learned of Blaine's disappearance, they were concerned. Eddie had been found murdered in a burned-out house, and Blaine hadn't shown up for work in 2 days. That could mean one of two things. Either Blaine was involved in the murder and was on the run, or he was another victim. No one at the restaurant knew where Blaine Tucker's new apartment was located, which put the search in limbo. Suddenly, a few days after the crime, a suspicious vehicle appeared near the burned-out house. As forensic investigators continued to work the scene, they spotted the driver watching closely. He parked in the driveway and watched the investigators work for a while. He then attempted to enter the building, claiming he was looking for his friend, but was stopped and detained. According to an unidentified witness, on the day of the crime, he saw Dale Manapeni, bloodied and in the company of a girl who was also covered in blood. Frightened, he quickly said goodbye to the couple and left, knowing Dale's tendency to be aggressive and temperamental. When the witness noticed that the burned house was surrounded by police tape, he suspected that Dale may have been involved in the incident. Although the witness did not know the identity of the girl who was with Dale, he was certain that the couple had been in the house for at least several days prior to the arson. The information gained led to the suspension of the search for Blaine Tucker, and detectives focused on a new direction, beginning the search for Dale and his mysterious companion. They were now the prime suspects in the murder and arson case. Not much was known about Dale, but it was possible to find information about his criminal record. He was a white male with blonde hair and blue eyes, originally from Ashland, Kentucky. Dale drove a black Honda, and his license plate was fixed, making it much easier to find him. An alert was issued, and all law enforcement agencies in the city were tasked with tracking Dale's vehicle. In addition, residents of the city were alerted through the media of the possible danger and encouraged to notify police if they saw the black Honda or the suspect himself. However, the move did not yield significant results. Dale had a criminal record for violent crimes and multiple burglaries. He liked to break into homes and sell the stolen goods to live off the proceeds. By the time these events occurred, he was barely 20 years old and also had a history of illegal substance charges. Detectives reached out to Dale's family in search of the prime suspect. Relatives reported that they had not heard from the young man in a long time, but they were not surprised that the police were looking for him. Dale had always caused trouble, had a wayward demeanor, and had been in trouble with the law on several occasions. His downfall began after the tragic death of his mother when he was a teenager. This loss affected him greatly, and he became withdrawn and violent. His mother was a single mom, and Dale was left to fend for himself. At this age, he got into partying and became a womanizer. Despite his behavior, he was charming and easily made new acquaintances, including relationships with women. Dale grew up in an environment of marginalized people, alcohol and prohibition, which did not contribute to his formation as a person. His violent temper, which was exacerbated by alcohol and illegal substances, played a major role in his criminal career. He first went to prison in 2000 before moving to Louisville, where he started a relationship with a girl and wanted to develop it. Relatives provided police with photos of Dale and helped establish the name of his lover, Jennifer Smith, which matched what was found in the murdered Eddie's notebook. Detectives learned Jennifer's address and determined that she was the one seen with Dale on the day of the crime, when both were bloodied. When detectives arrived at the address, only Jennifer's mother was home. She said that she had not seen her daughter for a long time. The woman saw the news about her boyfriend's problems and realized that the police were also looking for Jennifer. At the time, the girl was 23 years old and attending college. Jennifer and her boyfriend didn't live in the same place, constantly moving between rented apartments and motels. The mother confirmed that Jennifer was indeed dating Dale and emphasized that the girl had a strong attachment to her boyfriend. After taking Eddie's life, both disappeared, and the mother believed that they had left town. She was extremely concerned for her daughter's fate and promised to report any news. The mother asked that Jennifer not be harmed, suggesting that she might be the victim of a criminal. It took the police a long time to find any trace of the suspects in the city. But shortly after the visit to Jennifer's home, an important new call came in. It turned out that Jennifer had returned home and expressed a desire to meet with detectives. The investigators immediately headed to her home. From the very beginning of the meeting, it was obvious that the student was agitated about something. After some questioning, she began to speak candidly. Jennifer admitted that Dale had been involved in Eddie's death, but that wasn't all. She also knew that he had killed another man named Blaine Tucker and provided his address. While Jennifer was transported to the station for further questioning, a police squad went to Blaine Tucker's listed address. Law enforcement gained access to the apartment through the owner and found the 73-year-old man's body on the bed, with multiple stab wounds to his chest and torso. The attacker had used a kitchen knife, which was consistent with the method of crime in Eddie's case. There were no signs of arson in the apartment, but belongings were scattered and valuables were stolen. The knife was found next to the body on the bed. The knife was then sent for examination, where forensic experts found fingerprints on its handle. These prints matched the data in the database and belonged to Dale, which confirmed his continued criminal activity. At this time, Jennifer was being interviewed by the police. She admitted that she didn't realize how dangerous her boyfriend was when they first met. They had met through mutual friends at a party, and Jennifer was immediately attracted to Dale. At the time of their arrest, they had only been together for 2 weeks. She found Dale charming and attractive, and at the beginning of their relationship, his image seemed very positive. During the first week of their affair, Jennifer was happy despite their nomadic lifestyle. The girl's mother kicked them out of the house, not accepting their frequent hangouts in bars, and they were forced to constantly move from place to place. During one of the hangouts, they met Eddie and his buddy Blaine, both of whom were very friendly. After hearing the couple's story, Eddie agreed to take them in. At the time, he was pleased with himself, as he was able to quit his addiction to alcohol, by his own admission, thanks to the help of other people in the AA club. That is why Eddie was imbued with the idea that one should help his neighbors. He also understood the couple, as he himself had faced housing difficulties after moving. Unfortunately, he didn't realize that his kindness could turn into a knife in the face. Jennifer revealed that they had been staying at Eddie's for a few days. On the fateful night, Dale had abused alcohol and prohibition and had gotten intimate with Jennifer right in Eddie's bed. The landlord caught them engaged in this activity and was extremely displeased with their insolence, leading to an argument. Jennifer immediately left the room, and at some point Dale ran out, slamming the door, rushed into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and returned to Eddie. A few minutes later, Dale came out covered in blood and said they needed to get out of the house. He grabbed the girl by the shoulders and shook her. Jennifer was shocked. Apparently, at this point, she had stained her clothes with the victim's blood. After some brief deliberation, Dale set fire to the bedroom of the hospitable host. The couple took all their belongings and fled. It all took about 45 minutes from the time of the massacre. The lovers later disposed of the items. Jennifer claimed that she was not involved in the crime and was unable to stop the boyfriend with words. She was even afraid to go into the bedroom after the murder. The girl was so scared that she didn't even think to call an ambulance. Especially, she didn't know how her boyfriend would react to it. In a state of shock, Jennifer was forced to obey him and help cover her tracks. Finding themselves in a tight spot, the couple urgently needed to find shelter for the night. Remembering that Blaine had left them his address in case they needed it, they decided to take advantage of his offer. However, after hiding the truth from him about the crime they had committed, they made sure to behave as usual. After arriving at Blaine's house, they changed their clothes, showered, and looked as if nothing had happened. Blaine, Knowing that his friend Eddie had already assisted them, didn't refuse the overnight stay, although he noted their nervousness and late visit. Jennifer was so exhausted that she instantly fell asleep on the couch around 4:30 a.m. Waking up later, she saw Dale coming out of Blaine's bedroom, again covered in blood. Scared out of her wits, she didn't dare ask what had happened. Dale, as if nothing had happened, had burglarized the apartment after another massacre. Jennifer didn't even try to go into the bedroom, knowing she would see something horrible there. Instead, she dutifully gathered up everything of value as Dale had ordered, and the two of them hurriedly left the place, hiding the evidence of their crime. Dale was soon apprehended while driving the stolen vehicle. The investigation revealed that on March 30th, he visited a bar in Daytona Beach where he struck up a conversation with a 75-year-old man. Dale likely purposely targeted elderly and gullible people using his charm. This time, he convinced the old man to rent a hotel room, and once they were in the room, he pulled out a knife and threatened him. However, because the victim immediately handed over the money and car keys, Dale did not kill him. He left the hotel and attempted to break into several cars in the parking lot until he found the right one. After the perpetrator left, hotel employees treated the victim and called the police. Miami police officers quickly identified Dale from surveillance footage provided to them by their Louisville counterparts. They were able to locate and arrest him, after which he was extradited to Louisville. When questioned, Dale willingly cooperated with law enforcement. He admitted that when Eddie tried to kick him and Jennifer out of the house, an argument ensued between them. During the conflict, he lost his temper, took a knife, and killed Eddie. Dale then realized the need to cover his tracks, so he and Jennifer took all the valuables from the house and set it on fire. The next step was to take the life of Blaine Tucker, who Dale suspected might have told on the crime. The intruder used the knife again, killed Blaine, then robbed him, and escaped with Jennifer. Shortly after his arrest, Dale left no doubt of his guilt, admitting full responsibility for both crimes. He immediately took the blame for the massacres of Eddie and Blaine, claiming that Jennifer was only a passive companion, not involved in the crimes. According to him, she followed him of her own volition and did not actively participate in the crimes. After his confession, Dale was charged with several counts: premeditated murder, robbery, and arson. The judicial system was strict, and he faced the death penalty. To avoid the highest penalty, Dale agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution, which allowed him to avoid execution, but did not hinder his sentence. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without parole. Jennifer Smith pleaded guilty to accessory to the crimes and arson and was sentenced to 10 years in prison on September 30th, 2008. Unlike Dale, her sentence was significantly lighter. After serving 5 years, Jennifer was released on parole in 2011 when she turned 29. Sometimes love and hate are so closely intertwined that one day they can lead to a terrible tragedy. In the dark corners of the human soul, where jealousy and resentment merge into a deadly cocktail, thoughts are born that can destroy everything in their path. And so began a story that shook the small town of Milford and left an indelible mark on it. One morning, when the sun's rays were just beginning to penetrate the fog, the body of a young woman, once full of life and dreams, was found in her own home. But this was not just a murder. It was a massacre, cruel and merciless. Her face still bore the marks of violence, and there was an oppressive silence in the air, as if death itself was lingering, watching the horror that was just beginning to unfold before the detectives. Behind every piece of evidence lurked a shadow, the shadow of a man willing to do anything to satisfy his violent desires. But who was this man? A former lover whose obsession had crossed the line of sanity? Or someone lurking in an even deeper shadow? The evidence pointed in different directions, confusing the investigators and leaving them at a loss. Everyone involved in this tragedy carried a piece of evil within them, and each had their own secret. But one thing was clear from the beginning: this crime could not remain unsolved. Dark passions, once released, were waiting to turn life into a nightmare. And that nightmare was only the beginning. On August 24, 2012, Matthew Pugh, Alexandra's ex-boyfriend, was charged with first-degree murder and home invasion. At the time of the charges, Matthew was already serving time in a correctional facility for assaulting a woman in 2008. At that time, he threatened the victim with a gun, took her purse, and when she tried to resist, shot her in the arm. The investigation revealed that Matthew's problems began even earlier, when Alexandra informed him in prison that she wanted to end the relationship. According to his cellmates, the news sent Matthew into a rage. He was obsessed with Alexandra and wrote her a threatening 8-page letter. The girl began to fear for her life, and her mother initiated an investigation in prison, as a result of which Matthew was banned from writing to Alexandra. As a consequence, his prison sentence was increased by several months. Despite the fact that Matthew was furious about these events, after his release, he did not outwardly show any aggression towards his ex-girlfriend. He started a new relationship and even became a father. But in the depths of his soul, he continued to hatch a plan of revenge. But, as always, justice is slow to pass judgment. What really brought Matt to the dock? 3 years later, in February 2015, Matthew found himself in court. The prosecution argued that the crime was motivated by jealousy and carefully planned. Matthew's defense attorney insisted on his innocence, pointing to the lack of direct evidence, DNA or fingerprints, at the crime scene. However, Matthew's position took a sharp turn for the worse when he began to answer the prosecution's questions. His desperate attempts to prove his innocence looked unconvincing, especially in light of his brother's testimony. The jury went into deliberations, and the decision was not an easy one. The case was full of gaps and contradictions. Many considered Matthew a pathological liar, and there was even a need to restate his version of events in court. But to understand why justice was so harsh on Matthew, we have to go back to the days when the police were just beginning to unravel the tangle of this complex case. Some of Jason's past has been uncovered. As it turns out, he also had a criminal record, more than 5 years for selling illegal substances. He also drove a car similar to the one described by one of the victim's neighbors. Another witness reported seeing this car, dark green in color, practically all day outside Alexandra's house. Jason continued to insist on his innocence, citing that this model of car was one of the most popular in the city at the time. Checking the new boyfriend's word, detectives were never able to confirm his arrival at the clothing store to purchase pants around 3 a.m. In fact, he was there much later in the evening, which in no way matched his story. It seemed he might have been lying to lead the investigation into a dead end, but all suspicions were dispelled by accessing the geolocation of his calls. It turned out that his cell phone had not been in the Milford area all day. Police eventually removed him from the list of suspects, and it was Matt's turn again. Police spoke to Sandra's mother to find out more about him. The woman had never liked the young man. First of all, because of the age difference. Matt was 7 years older than her daughter. In addition, he had a criminal record and was not interested in development. Unlike Sandra, he didn't want to work and was dragging her down. Now detectives turned to his employer. It turned out that on that fateful day, he had actually left work much earlier than he should have. He lied about the exact time. Instead of 9:15 a.m., the young man finished work at 8:39. After that, he ended up at the gas station, but not at noon, as he told police, but at 2:10 a.m. These discrepancies, in his words, were alarming. He was indeed at the car dealerships until 4 p.m., but the time periods he himself stated were all wrong. Perhaps he was just unknowingly confused about the time, but investigators believed Matt was a criminal. On May 26th, a search warrant was obtained for his home. Inside, everything was in perfect order and clean. Nothing suspicious except for duct tape. It was suspected that it was the remnants from this roll that might have been found on the victim's face. However, this did not indicate any involvement in the crime, because many people have duct tape in their homes. All other tests and analysis failed to prove Matt's involvement. All his possessions were searched, but the results were nil. The investigation seemed to have reached a dead end. The only thing the police were able to do was to send the found duct tape to the laboratory for analysis. It turned out that this type of duct tape was quite specific and was not common. It was not sold in regular stores or on the internet. In 2006, only 3 companies out of those close to us used it. One of them was an aircraft parts factory where Matt's ex-boyfriend worked. The pieces of duct tape found on the deceased's face had the same adhesive backing. That could point to the real culprit. Law enforcement officials decided to recontact Matt's family. They were able to get some valuable information. According to his brother, Matt had a very violent and irascible character, and he even had a motive against the ex-girlfriend. They managed to find out that he gave Sandra his Nissan car in 2002 and later lent her $2,000 in 2003. In January 2004, she made the decision to break up while he was in jail and didn't pay him back anything. This probably angered him. At a time when police were still just beginning to look into Matt's past affairs, someone already sensed trouble was coming. When questioned by the police, Jason said that they had called Alexandra around noon. The couple were quietly discussing plans for the evening. According to him, the lovers were going to have dinner together. Around 12:20 p.m. during the dialogue on the phone, Sandra suddenly asked him to wait as she saw her ex-boyfriend outside the house. Jason then heard the door open and Alexandra asked, "What are you doing here?" But there was no response. The door then closed and the girl returned to the conversation, but said she couldn't talk right now and cut the call. In Jason's opinion, Alexandra let someone into her house and then didn't call back. This seemed suspicious to him, and he even got a little jealous. 15 minutes later, the girl still hadn't called back, and he started to get really worried. Luckily, she answered the phone at 12:35 a.m., and they talked for a couple more minutes. Alexandra didn't revisit the question of who came to see her or why. Thanks to Jason's testimony, it was possible to narrow down the time frame in which Alexandra died. The time frame was now 12:37 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. According to Jason, during this period, he was at work, driving his car around the city and checking equipment. After 3 a.m., he drove to a clothing store where he wanted to pick up some new pants for a date. Around 4:30 p.m., he called Alexandra again, but she never answered. So he went to her house and saw police cars outside the house. The police officers communicated with the victim's loved ones and found out that Alexandra's only ex-boyfriend was Matthew. However, they had broken off the relationship 2 years before these events. While the request for a warrant to analyze cell phones was being processed, detectives talked to the girl's relatives. It turned out that the breakup with the ex-boyfriend had not gone entirely smoothly. Linda knew that Matthew had a criminal record and that he mistreated Alexandra. Their relationship continued until Matthew went to prison for the first time in 1998. During this period, Alexandra continued to support and visit him. But he ended up behind bars seriously and for a long time. Despite the sincerity and love, there were growing doubts in the relationship. By January 2004, they officially broke up. One of the reasons was Matthew's rudeness, who was behaving in an increasingly threatening manner. They continued to communicate, but Matthew became more and more aggressive and angry. It seemed that the distance between them was only growing, and a renewed relationship was out of the question. Matthew was located, and during this period he was living with his spouse about 30 minutes away from the murdered woman's home. On the day the police arrived, he was working at a Papa John's restaurant. It was there that the 15-minute conversation with the police officers took place. The guy admitted that he had 2 jobs. The second was an aircraft parts company located about an hour north of Milford. He said he was on shift the day of the crime from 6:30 a.m. to 3 a.m., after which he went home. When he was informed that Alexandra was dead, he was a little confused. Apparently, the ex-con did not trust the police. Nevertheless, he admitted that he had spoken to her on the phone a few days before Sandra's death. But their last meeting had taken place at least 4 weeks before the tragic denouement. The detectives then left, but that was not the end of their communication with Matthew. The next day, he himself arrived at the station and reported that he had lied. He admitted that he did arrive at work at 6:30 a.m., but at 9:15 a.m. he asked his supervisor to excuse him and left. He spent virtually the entire day at home and then went into town in the afternoon to drive a sick relative. In any case, Matt claimed he was not in Milford or even near the suburbs that day. He agreed to DNA testing and provided police with his clothes that he wore on the day of his ex-girlfriend's death. Despite admitting to lying, Matt's alibi was able to be confirmed. Nevertheless, he and Jason remained the prime suspects in the crime. However, to really understand this confusing story, it is necessary to delve deeper into the lives of not only Matt, but also Jason, Alexandra, and her boyfriends. After all, It is their complicated relationships and ulterior motives that could be the key to unraveling this tragic denouement. Let's find out what was really going on in their lives and what could have prompted such a terrible outcome. On December 9, 1979, Alexandra Duxey was born in New Haven, Connecticut. Her family and friends knew her as Sandra. Alexandra's childhood was spent in the picturesque Milford neighborhood, just an hour's drive from New York City. Her parents, John and Linda, met in 1974 and married a few months later, creating a tight-knit family. Alexandra had two older brothers with whom she always maintained a close and friendly relationship. Despite the age difference, they protected their younger sister and helped their parents by playing sports and spending time together in active games. The family lived in a spacious house where the basement became Alexandra's personal space. Over time, she turned it not only into a cozy bedroom, but also into a gym, where she often invited friends for sleepovers and spending time together. Since childhood, Sandra was fond of dancing and gymnastics. In high school, she had a dream of becoming an actress, an aspiration that matched her bright and energetic character. Dancing was an important part of her life, and she actively participated in various contests and competitions, winning awards and recognition. Sandra's life was full. In addition to dancing, she was a serious student, aspiring to get a degree in law. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in college and took dance courses while getting a part-time job at a bank. During one of her outings, she met her first love, a guy named Matthew. They both shared a love of sports and a drive to succeed. Sandra later earned a bachelor's degree in finance and became a systems analyst at the same bank, where she worked for several years. She devoted almost 10 years of her life to dancing, while simultaneously obtaining her real estate agent's license. At the age of 23, Sandra also became a teaching assistant at a dance academy. Her career path developed rapidly. She often performed in New York City, participated in dance routines at events, and even starred in music videos. When she turned 26, she started working with an Atlanta-based producer, creating demos of music videos for music albums. Her dreams slowly began to come true. She found an agent in New York who helped her get cast, and soon Sandra got a role in a popular TV series. It was a minor role, but for her it was an important step on the road to success. However, because of the busy career, Sandra had almost no time for a personal life. Although she dated Matthew for several years, in January 2004, they decided to part ways. Alexandra decided to focus solely on work and dancing. At the same time, her family was also going through a difficult period. Her parents decided to separate, and her father returned to Florida to be closer to his elderly mother. Sandra's brothers had already moved away, creating their own families, leaving her alone with her mother. Even though most of the house was empty, Sandra continued to live in the basement, which she had equipped for her needs. Here she had everything she needed for training, as well as a stand with numerous awards for her dance achievements. In the basement, she lived together with her large dog. Her busy life did not prevent her from continuing her acting auditions, and she had new prospects in the movie industry. During the same period, Sandra began to actively engage in charity work, organizing the collection of things and toys for children from low-income families. She also planned, together with like-minded people, to open a free canteen for the needy. But everything changed on May 19, 2006. That day, Sandra met up with her best friend Nicole, with whom they worked out together at the gym. They worked out from 10:15 to 11:15 a.m., after which Nicole left and Sandra decided to stay and work out some more. Then she was going to go home, have lunch, clean up, and get ready for her evening plans. Nicole tried to contact Alexandra around 4 p.m., but her call went straight to voicemail. This was highly unusual since Sandra was always on call due to her busy and demanding activities that required constant communication. Nicole had never experienced a situation where Alexandra didn't return a call. When Linda, Sandra's mother, drove up to the house at approximately 4:30 p.m., she immediately noticed that the front door was wide open and Sandra's beloved dog was on the patio. The white Mitsubishi car that Alexandra drove was parked in the driveway. It all seemed strange. The door of the house was always tightly closed, and the dog couldn't go outside without a collar and leash. This time, however, she just sat there, tail wagging. Panic gripped Linda, and she hurried into the house, calling out to her daughter, but there was no response. Anxiety grew with every step. Climbing the stairs to the basement, Linda found large drops of blood on the floor. Going lower, she noticed another large stain. What she was able to see next was horrifying. A woman's legs lay in front of her. Sandra was on her back, motionless and without signs of life, in a huge pool of blood. She had suffered a serious head injury and was lying under the table in the room in an unnatural pose. Linda's initial thought was that her daughter might have fallen down the stairs and hit her head on the radiator, which also showed a bloody mark. Linda, unable to believe what was happening, rushed to her daughter to check for a pulse, but there was none. Barely containing her emotions, Linda dialed the emergency number. In a panic, she screamed into the receiver, describing the horrible scene she had witnessed. The dispatcher had difficulty understanding her because of her confused speech and tears interspersed with incoherent mumbling. Eventually, the dispatcher realized that Linda had found her daughter dead on the basement floor. Several officers arrived on the scene. When they entered the house, the sight they saw in the basement was one of the most gruesome of their careers. Blood was splattered all over the basement, especially on the floor, but also on the furniture and walls. Even the memorial table with the 12 trophies and awards was covered in drops of blood. Sandra's face was literally crushed. The damage to her head was so severe that one eye was missing. A blade shard was found in her skull, and the blade itself lay nearby. Sandra had been stabbed with a kitchen knife with such fury that the handle of the knife broke off and the tip remained inside. Alexandra suffered a serious facial injury. The girl's mother noticed that one of her trophies was missing and assumed that it was the one that had been stabbed that had destroyed all of Alexandra's beauty. Police officers immediately realized that she was a murder victim and her injuries were incompatible with life. In addition to the horrific injuries and the crime weapon, detectives found a distinct shoe print in the basement with blood on it. However, it was not a regular sole. It appeared as if the shoe print did not have a tread pattern. Faint traces of blood were also found in other rooms, including the bathroom, where there were traces of blood on the toilet seat and sink, presumably left by the assailant who was trying to wash his hands. Investigators also identified attempts to clean up blood in some parts of the house, indicating an attempt to cover their tracks. Law enforcement officials suspected a personal motive for the massacre, especially given the missing trophy. The brutality and force with which the blows were delivered convinced investigators that the perpetrator should be sought among the victim's acquaintances. Most of the furniture and belongings in the apartment were left untouched, but almost all the clothes were taken out of the closet. Jewelry and money, which could be of interest to the robbers, remained in place. All this gave the impression that the perpetrator was looking for something, as things were scattered on the bed and floor. According to the police, Alexandra was attacked when she went down to the basement. She was probably pushed down the stairs, which led to the first injury, hitting her head on the radiator. The girl was not killed immediately, as evidenced by clear signs of a struggle. Detectives immediately realized that the knife used to kill Sandra was brought in from outside the house, as none of the cutlery in the house was missing. Investigators also gained access to the victim's cell phone and more than 100 numbers she knew and had to thoroughly check each of them. When investigators examined the crime scene, they found one curious detail. The trash bag had been pulled out of the trash garbage can. This indicated that the perpetrator was probably trying to hide the evidence and avoid leaving any traces. He may have changed into different clothes and used the large bag to get rid of items covered in blood. By 5 p.m., Alexandra's brother and her friend Nicole arrived at the scene of the tragedy. The girl was shocked and hysterical, as she had seen Sandra alive just a few hours ago. The quiet neighborhood of Milford, where Alexandra lived, was shocked by what had happened. Locals were in an uproar and sought any information about what had happened, but police refused to make any comment until they had all the details. The house was carefully cordoned off. Nicole said that after practice, Alexandra was going to get ready for a night out with her new boyfriend. They planned to spend the evening at a restaurant. Her friend mentioned that his name was Jay, but she couldn't provide other details, such as a last name or additional information. This mystery man caught the special attention of investigators. Detectives and Alexandra's loved ones began canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing possible witnesses in hopes of finding important leads. Milford was known for its low crime rate, and this tragedy shocked the entire neighborhood. Alexandra was a local celebrity thanks to her supporting roles on the TV series Law & Order, and her tragic death drew national attention. The The police asked the media for help in locating witnesses, which sparked a real wave of interest from local journalists eager to get any information they could. While investigating the murder case of Alexandra Duxey, police encountered scattered testimonies from neighbors. One of them said that at about 12:30 a.m., he noticed a red pickup truck near the victim's home. The vehicle was clearly not registered to local residents, he said. Another witness, around 4 p.m., saw a dark-skinned male walking past the house and then getting into a dark green Honda Accord. Unfortunately, neither witness remembered the license plate numbers or the exact location of the vehicles. While detectives were trying to clear up the details, Alexandra's new boyfriend, Jason Malone, caught the attention of law enforcement. Initial attempts to contact him were answered by his sister, who provided the necessary information. When Jason came in for questioning, he looked visibly agitated, but firmly maintained that he had nothing to do with the incident. Jason explained that he and Alexandra started dating after he went to the bank with a friend. According to Jason, he was so smitten with her beauty that he asked his friend to give him her phone number. Alexandra, impressed by such a romantic gesture, agreed to give her contact, and they soon started chatting, which led to their first date. At the time they met, Jason was a couple years older than Alexandra. He had just moved out from his ex-girlfriend and was living with his mother. He was having trouble rebuilding his relationship with his ex and was having trouble on the personal front. He worked for a power company, checking electric meters around town. Alexandra preferred not to rush to make any official statements about her relationship with Jason, as after a long 6 years with her previous boyfriend, she wanted to approach the new romance cautiously and not jump to premature conclusions. This caution seemed to be a foreshadowing of the unpredictable and tragic changes that were looming. And so, as the picture of events began to take on increasingly darker shades, the investigators' attention returned to one of the key players in the case, Matt Pugh. Despite the available evidence and the complexities surrounding the new suspect, it's worth focusing on Matt's interrogation and seeing what else can be gleaned to shed light on this tragic story. A new twist in the investigation came on June 14th when the suspect was re-interviewed. Detectives made arguments pointing out inconsistencies in his statement. Despite this, the suspect was able to explain all the discrepancies, and police once again did not have enough evidence to file charges. It was only towards the end of the year that DNA tests provided new evidence. The blood found in the basement was entirely Alexandra's, while the blood drops in the bathtub were mixed. It was the blood of Sandra and an unidentified man. However, due to insufficient concentration, an accurate DNA profile could not be extracted. Experts could determine that the perpetrator was a dark-skinned male. But this did not help solve the case, as both of the main suspects, Matt and Jay, shared the same trait. Hair found on the victim's body could not be identified, and fingerprints found at the crime scene did not match those of the suspects. Even a specific shoe print remained undetermined. Eventually, the investigation came to a dead end once again. In hopes of moving the case forward, a $50,000 reward was put out for any information that could help solve the crime. In 2010, it was decided to expand the search and ask for help from prisoners. Photos of Alexandra were sent to correctional institutions. In September 2011, police received a call from an inmate named Paula. He claimed that his former cellmate Christopher Richards had allegedly had an affair with Alexandra 2 years before her death. According to Paula, Christopher and Alexandra were together in the period between her breakup with Matt and the beginning of her relationship with Jay. Information about this relationship was unknown. Paula also reported that Christopher, upon learning of the breakup, threatened to kill Alexandra. However, subsequent investigation revealed that Paula had lied. Christopher had no relationship with Alexandra, and there had been no correspondence or phone calls between them. In all likelihood, the inmate was trying to frame his cellmate. 2 weeks after that incident, a bus driver named Jeremy, who had been friends with Alexandra for a long time, showed up unexpectedly. He recalled that he had once witnessed the girl receiving a threatening message from a man named Donovan, demanding repayment of a debt and threatening to kill her if the money was not returned. Jeremy claimed that this happened just 2 weeks before the tragedy. However, it turned out that this claim was also false and irrelevant to the case. 6 years passed, and finally, in August 2012, detectives managed to get really important information. They were approached by Anthony Pugh, Matt's cousin, with whom the police had already spoken earlier. It was he who told about how Matt gave Alexandra a car and lent her $2,000. However, Anthony's story began long before these events, back in 1993, when Matt involved him in criminal schemes. Subsequently, both were convicted, but in 2005 and 2006, alternately released and got a job at the same factory. Despite the good relationship, a year later Matt betrayed his brother, and Anthony was again behind bars. The resentment against his brother was accumulating, and now he decided to take revenge by revealing the whole truth. Anthony revealed that after breaking up with Alexandra, Matt literally went mad with jealousy and began to contemplate killing her. Initially, he planned to inject her with a lethal dose of an illegal substance to make it look like an accidental overdose. But when he found out about her new relationship, Matt switched to a more brutal plan of reprisal. Anthony also said the brothers worked at an aircraft factory where Matt stole gloves and special duct tape that he intended to use to commit the crime. Police were inclined to believe that Anthony was not lying, as he clearly wanted a reward for his information. He later explicitly stated that his goal was not only $50,000, but also a just punishment for his brother. In verifying the information, police discovered that they had previously missed an important fact. At around 11:47 a.m. on the day of the crime, Matt was indeed in cell phone coverage in Milford, and then left briefly. At 12:07 p.m., he returned to the area again and remained there for over an hour. This information was the crucial basis for Matt's arrest and charges. And, as is often the case, anxious premonitions did not fail. Soon evidence was found that made everyone shudder. Forensic experts revealed the cause of the girl's death. Multiple stab, slash, and blunt head injuries, inflicted mainly in the facial area. It was confirmed that she was killed not only with a knife, but also with some kind of trophy that was missing from the house. She was beaten so badly that she swallowed several knocked-out teeth before she died. Experts managed to find one important piece of evidence: a single hair stuck to the dried blood on the girl's body. It didn't seem to belong to Sandra herself. They also found pieces of duct tape on her face, apparently used to cover her mouth during the massacre. In late August 2012, after years of investigation, Matthew Pugh, Alexandra's ex-boyfriend, was finally charged. The charges included first-degree murder and trespassing in her home. Despite the defense's best efforts, the case was convoluted and complicated, but the evidence against Matt was overwhelming. When the jury went to deliberate, no one could have predicted how long it would take them to reach a verdict. The deliberations dragged on as they had to sort out all the details of this convoluted story. It took 3 tense days before the jury, having carefully weighed all the evidence and testimony, reached their verdict. Matthew Pugh was found guilty of first-degree murder and trespassing. The court sentenced him to 60 years in prison for the murder and added another 20 years for trespassing in Alexandra's home. This harsh sentence, handed down amid years of uncertainty and suspicion, was the final act in a tragic story that had gone unsolved for so long. Sometimes envy and lust for power cloud the mind, leading to actions that a person did not even realize he was capable of committing. Everything starts with a slight itch in the depths of the soul, a vague feeling of injustice. And then this feeling grows, becomes stronger, devours from within, turning a man into a monster. In an instant, everything changed. Shattered dreams, blood on the cold asphalt, the sounds of sirens and screams that will linger in the ears of those who witnessed it. This evening in Washington, D.C. started out like so many others. Smiles, laughter, parties, friends. Nicole was young and full of life. She had just gotten a part in a new play. She was going to be a big hit on stage. Her future was bright and promising. But no one knew that at that very moment, someone full of hatred and envy was already pressing his fingers to the cold metal of a gun, preparing to make a step that would forever change the lives of many. The brutal reprisal caught her at the worst possible moment. And in this story, there will be no simple explanations or obvious motives. Everything will be intertwined: fear, psychosis, betrayal, and blood. But the worst of it all is the realization that evil can come from those you knew, from those who stood by you and seemed to be a part of your life. Investigators reconstructed the picture of that terrible night, but even they could not fully understand what led an ordinary young boy to such a bloody finale. Was it a desperate cry for help? Or had cruelty always lived in his heart, hidden behind a mask of normality? This story is like a broken puzzle. We'll be picking it up piece by piece, one by one, delving into the darkness behind each of the characters. Let's start with those who have remained in the shadows, the accomplices without whom this terrible crime might never have happened. The perpetrator did not act alone, but their fates turned out differently. Some tried to save themselves with a deal, some counted on leniency. Their names were also heard in the courtroom, though the focus was on the main perpetrator. Fleming's associates were also tried, although they were tried separately from the main defendant. On February 27, 2007, Sergio Simons, Rudy's cousin, heard his sentence. He was found to be an accessory to assault and brutal murder. The young criminal was offered a plea bargain with the prosecution. He agreed to plead guilty to aggravated robbery. As a result of this plea, the court sentenced him to 10 years in prison without the right to appeal. April 26th of the same year in the dock was Ashley Evans, who, according to the investigation, not only participated in the crime, but was its initiator, being a close friend of Rudy. Like Simons, Ashley was offered a deal with the prosecution, which she agreed to on the advice of her lawyer. After pleading guilty to first-degree robbery, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The court deemed this term sufficient time for her to realize the gravity of her act. At the hearing, the parents of Nicole, the victim of the attack, stated that they forgive Ashley. However, they expressed dissatisfaction with the sentence. The mother of the murdered girl thought that 6 years was a negligible amount of time. Her daughter would never return, and Ashley, coming out of prison young and full of energy, would have the opportunity to start a new life. Nicole, on the other hand, had been cruelly denied that right. Ashley's future was open. She could reform and build a new destiny. In the end, Ashley did not even serve her sentence. In 2010, she was released on parole. She was only 18 years old at the time of the crime, and she was released at the age of 23. Tatiana McDonald and one other band member were not charged. However, even after the verdict, Rudy's story did not end. He decided to fight on. A few years after Rudy was behind bars, he began to try to appeal his sentence. By this point, he had already given up his defense attorney, who had not initially tried to challenge the court's decision. The new defense lawyer argued that the punishment for Fleming was excessively harsh. The lawyer cited his client's mental state and his young age. It was revealed that Rudy had been diagnosed with psychosis, which provided an opportunity to question the validity of his conviction. Counsel argued that Fleming was incapacitated at the time of the offense and appealed on that basis. These actions necessitated additional psychiatric examinations. However, as a result of all the tests, Fleming was recognized as sane, and the case was refused to be reconsidered. The court concluded that Rudy was aware of his actions, and the attack on a group of young people was caused by his cruelty and hatred. His bloodlust made him a danger to society from the start, and he deserved a life sentence. The defense lawyer did not stop there and appealed again. The court assembled a panel to evaluate the offender's mental state based on numerous reports from psychiatrists. Evidence was reviewed that showed Rudy had faked and exaggerated the symptoms of his mental illness in an attempt to mislead doctors. He hoped to be found insane to avoid punishment. His mental state had been tested before he was sentenced, and Rudy had previously been found sane. Attempts to deceive the psychiatrists by telling ridiculous stories about imaginary creatures were unsuccessful. All of these were considered lies. Fleming's low level of intelligence only added to the ridiculousness of his attempts to evade responsibility. The perpetrator never realized his guilt, never repented, and only tried to get leniency through false statements. When it became clear that his tricks would not work, he argued that there was insufficient evidence against him. However, these arguments were easily refuted. The investigation provided irrefutable evidence of his guilt. Witnesses confidently identified him as the shooter. The investigation gathered strong evidence that pointed directly at Rudy. Despite his attempts to appeal his sentence, it could not be commuted. Nevertheless, the perpetrator was sent to the psychiatric unit of the correctional facility for treatment, where he was prescribed medication to stabilize his emotional state. But before reaching this point, detectives collected every fragment of that fateful night. In 2 weeks of investigation, detectives managed to reconstruct a complete picture of this brutal attack. The version of the investigation was confirmed from the very first steps, and no one doubted the guilt of Rudy Fleming. His act was regarded as an act of senseless cruelty, which cut short the life of a young and talented actress whose career was just beginning and was much more promising than his own. In court, Fleming was described as a cold-blooded criminal, brimming with hatred and aggression. The charges against him were so weighty that his defense attorney had little chance of mitigating the sentence. Moreover, even the defense attorney admitted in court that taking the life of an innocent girl was an act for which there was no justification. In fact, he did not try to fight for leniency for his client. Realizing the hopelessness of the situation, Nicole's parents refused to attend the court hearings in the Fleming case. The mother of the deceased admitted that she did not want to waste a second of her life on this cowardly man. Jeffrey Sparks, Nicole's fiancé, was deeply hurt by her loss. But instead of openly expressing his hatred, he made his response more devastating to Rudy. "I won't hate you, because your real punishment is neglect. You're not worth paying attention to, and your place is behind bars." At the same time, the young man said he would fight against guns and politicians, whose decisions lead to marginalized people like Rudy being able to have guns and kill people. The victim's family compared the pain of the loss to the life sentence the perpetrator received. They can never get Nicole back. A similar position was supported by everyone who knew the girl. One professor who taught Nicole in college, upon learning of her death, remarked that she was gifted but lost to the theater world. But what drove Rudy to such an insane act? Criminal psychologists who studied Rudy Fleming's behavior argued that his actions fit the profile of an unstable personality with extremely low self-esteem. It was believed that on that fateful night, he plotted a series of crimes to elevate himself in the eyes of his gang and establish himself through crime. However, the situation spiraled out of control when he confronted Nicole, a girl who didn't know how to submit to fear or give in under pressure. She showed no fear of Rudy, which came as an unexpected blow to him. Instead of the respect he was expecting when holding a gun, he was met with unwavering determination. For the juvenile delinquent, this became a challenge that his sick ego could not withstand. This case developed with tragic inevitability, and the result was the death of a young, talented, and beautiful girl. Despite the attempts of psychologists to explain Rudy's motivation, the detective in charge of the case saw no justification for the murder in these explanations. To him, everything was clear. Fleming was the one who pulled the trigger, which meant he should be punished in full. Fleming, his cousin, and the 2 girls involved in the crime were arrested. Let's remember the moment it all started. January 5th, 1977. In a small town in Minnesota was born Nicole Dufresne. Since childhood, she stood out among her peers with her bright character and irrepressible energy. Her artistry manifested itself in literally everything, from school performances to ordinary conversations with friends. Creative spark burned in her so brightly that others knew that Nicole will certainly achieve something great. Already in her school years, her love of theater and art led her to the stage, where she felt at home. When it came time to choose her future profession, Nicole didn't even think twice. She enrolled in the theater department of the college, where her talent was noticed and recognized. Her performances won the hearts of the audience, and teachers admired her unconventional approach to roles. Nicole didn't just act. She lived her characters, creating more than just a performance on stage. But Minnesota was too small for her ambitions. Barely out of college, Nicole realized, to realize her potential, she needed to move on. First, she went to Seattle, where she tried to make her way in local theaters, but soon realized that the real opportunities await her in New York. This city was a magnet for people with dreams and ambitions, and Nicole was no exception. After moving to New York, she faced a harsh reality. The competition was fierce. But Nicole didn't just have talent. She had determination, a willingness to fight for her place in the sun. She did not give up, took on any role, developing as an actress and director. Her vision of theater art was fresh and innovative, which was repeatedly noted by colleagues and critics. It was here on the streets of this city that she began to build her career, moving closer to her dream. By the age of 28, Nicole Dufresne had managed to build a reputation in the theater world, directing 2 of her own plays and earning acclaim for her many performances. Critics unanimously praised her for her ability to handle any challenge, noting her composure and grace in handling the most difficult situations. Nicole was a master of finding the right words at the right moment and was confident in any company. Her friends admired her charm and sharp mind, which made her the center of attention in any situation. However, despite the external achievements, fate was preparing for Nicole a test with which she could not cope with the usual methods. Moving to New York not only brought Nicole career success, but also became a turning point in her personal life. At the time of those events, she was engaged to Jeffrey Sparks, one of her close friends, who was also beginning his journey in the acting career. Initially, their relationship was friendly, but over time, it turned into romantic feelings, and the couple decided to tie themselves in marriage, starting to prepare for the wedding. However, despite her personal and career successes, Nicole faced financial difficulties. Living in New York was expensive, and to support herself, she had to work part-time as a bartender in Manhattan. She had recently gotten a job at a prestigious bar, which allowed her to partially solve her financial problems. Nicole spent her days on vacation, her nights at the bar, and her evenings on stage. Her night job seemed like a normal part of city life, and she could not have guessed that this would be the beginning of her tragic fate. On January 27, 2005, Nicole Dufresne, her fiancé Jeffrey Sparks, and 2 of their friends decided to spend an evening on the night streets of Manhattan. They began with a visit to the bar where Nicole had been working for the past few months. After they had a few drinks, the company went outside to take a stroll around the city at night. When the young people left the bar around 3 a.m., they noticed a group of strangers. Despite their somewhat rowdy behavior, they were not out of line with decorum. On the street, after only a few dozen meters, the company encountered a group of young men, among whom were potential criminals. Jeffrey, wanting to avoid conflict, tried to pass by, but his attempt to avoid trouble turned tragic. One of the assailants struck him on the temple with a revolver, and Jeffrey fell, bleeding from the wound. At that moment, one of the robbers pulled out a gun and pointed it at Nicole, demanding her purse. Nicole, with her self-defense skills, was confident in her ability to protect herself and her friends. She tried to resolve the situation with words and, when that didn't work, forcefully shoved her attacker. But her confidence that diplomacy could solve any problem proved futile that night. Nicole didn't provoke aggression, but her confidence was ineffective against guns. The gun-wielding robbers weren't going to stop at threats. Being unprepared for the attack and lacking any real defense made her attempts at resistance futile. Tragedy was inevitable, and nothing could prevent it. 19-year-old Rudy Fleming was the leader of the gang and carried a gun. With his dark thoughts, he planned not just a robbery, but something more terrible. That night, he and his accomplices wanted to cash in on their victims. However, the behavior of Nicole, who dared to stand up to the armed robbers, made him furious and indignant. Although Rudy got what he wanted in the form of valuables, his evil intentions went beyond mere robbery. In a fit of rage, he shot Nicole in the chest, unwilling to forgive her bravery. After that, the attackers quickly fled the scene. Nicole's friends stayed with her, desperately trying to help and support her in her final moments. The girl was bleeding, and her breathing was becoming more and more intermittent. After a few minutes, she lost consciousness. The ambulance and police arrived on the scene shortly after the call, but unfortunately by this time, 28-year-old Nicole was already dead. An autopsy revealed that the wounds had damaged vital organs, and she died from blood loss before rescue workers arrived. Detectives immediately began interviewing witnesses, including employees of the bar where Nicole was spending the evening. Bartenders and patrons confirmed that Nicole's group was acting peacefully and not in conflict with others. Police were able to gather an accurate description of the perpetrators and soon apprehended all of the teens involved in the attack. The offenders ranged in age from 14 to 19 years old. Although none of them denied involvement in the robbery, their testimonies varied greatly, and none wanted to take responsibility for the murder. Despite the contradictions in their testimonies, detectives were able to reconstruct a rough picture of the events of that terrible night. The group of criminals, consisting of 5 boys and 2 girls, was active throughout the night. As the police found out, they were not limited to one robbery. Shortly before the attack on Nicole, the gang had already committed a robbery near the subway station, taking away a man's leather jacket and wallet. They then tried to attack a girl in the same neighborhood, but she managed to escape and avoid injury. Not satisfied with this, the criminals continued their search for new victims, and their next target was Nicole and her friends. According to one of the gang members, Rudy Fleming, their leader, displayed aggressive behavior throughout the evening. He openly talked about wanting to fight or hurt someone, but his friends took it as simple threats without giving it much thought. At first, it seemed that Rudy might come to his senses and not go all the way with his plans. He simply demanded money from his new victims while holding a Taurus revolver pointed downward to increase his intimidation. Despite Rudy's use of firearms, gang members claimed they were unaware of it. According to them, Rudy had not displayed a weapon during previous robberies and had not threatened anyone until he confronted Nicole and her friends who were returning home from a bar. It later turned out that Rudy had intended to kill everyone on the spot. His accomplices confirmed that Rudy had informed them of his intention after the attack. Fortunately, however, their actions were partially contained and the other victims survived. When Jeffrey Sparks was injured, Rudy's cousin, Servio Simons, tried to defuse the situation. He urged the victims not to resist and to simply hand over the money, thus hoping to prevent further crime. Rudy Fleming then managed to take possession of Nicole's purse and another girl's cell phone. He passed these items on to his gang mates Ashley Evans and Tatiana McDonald. At the time of the incident, Ashley had just turned 18, while Tatiana, a middle school student, was only 14 years old. Nicole, despite her own condition, tried to render aid to her lover, Jeffrey Sparks, who was injured, but thankfully not seriously. Jeffrey said they needed to leave, and he and Nicole headed in the opposite direction down the street they had come. Mary Jane followed them. However, when Nicole tried to leave the scene, Rudy Fleming intervened again. This set off a storm of emotions for Nicole. According to the teen's testimony, Nicole walked right up to Rudy and, looking him straight in the eye, yelled, "What's next? Are you going to shoot us?" In response to her aggressive behavior, Rudy shoved her in the chest and Nicole stepped back, but then approached him again. Perceiving her actions as a threat, Rudy pushed her away again. When Nicole did not retreat afterward, he shot her in the chest. The bullet went through and through, causing Nicole injuries incompatible with life. Nicole's companions denied this version of events. They claimed that Nicole was not aggressive and her actions did not provoke the shooting in any way. After Jeffrey and his friend heard the gunshot, they rushed to Nicole, who was lying on the pavement in a pool of blood forming. Within minutes, she died from blood loss, while in the arms of her loved ones. When the police arrived, everyone present was distressed and was by Nicole's side. At first, they were able to apprehend the 2 girls in the gang who were helping Rudy Fleming. They admitted that they did not expect that the main participant in the attack would go to such an extent, believing that the revolver was only used for intimidation. The girls realized that the situation was out of control when Rudy hit Nicole's boyfriend. However, further investigation revealed that the girls were not as harmless as they seemed at first glance. In fact, the motive for the attack was banal jealousy and a desire for fun. The gang members noticed Nicole and her friends laughing loudly and enjoying the evening. Ashley Evans, one of the girls in the gang, was annoyed by their carefree behavior. She pointed out the group as potential victims, believing them to be well off and suitable for robbery. Rudy, who was already conflicted, took this as the perfect excuse to attack. When Rudy was apprehended, he initially denied involvement in the incident. However, he was quickly turned in by witnesses, including 2 girls from his gang and Nicole's friends. Police officers detained Rudy Fleming and searched his home immediately after obtaining a warrant. The top priority for law enforcement was to find the crime weapon, but the revolver used in the crime was never recovered. Under pressure from the investigation, the teens admitted that Rudy and 2 girls in his group disposed of the weapon after the attack. Later, the revolver was found, and ballistic examination confirmed that it was the weapon that produced the fatal bullet. After information about the incident was published, there were critical comments about Nicole's actions. Some claimed that her behavior made the situation worse. On television, psychologists stated that Nicole made a mistake in trying to confront the armed attacker. However, Her fiancé, Jeffrey Sparks, claimed there was no active confrontation. According to him, they tried to avoid conflict by ceding their valuables to the attackers. Jeffrey insisted that Nicole's behavior was intended to appease the aggressor, not actively resist. In fact, Rudy had been looking for an excuse for conflict from the beginning. His desire to use the revolver was obvious, and it was confirmed by other gang members. The tragic event drew the attention of the Washington National Crime Prevention Council. In the discussions generated by the incident, much of the criticism was directed at Nicole's behavior. Experts stated that her actions in this situation were the worst possible. However, it was her fiancé, Jeffrey Sparks, who came to Nicole's defense. He argued that Nicole did not try to provoke the attacker, was not aggressive, and did not raise her voice. According to him, she only pleaded with the perpetrator to put the gun down and let them leave. Jeffrey flatly rejected claims that Nicole herself stepped on the perpetrator and approached him. He insisted that her request was solely to calm the aggressor and avoid further attack. In Jeffrey's opinion, the shooting was the result of Rudy initially looking for an excuse to use a weapon. On October 12, 2005, the trial began for Rudy Fleming, who refused to appear in the courtroom and watched the proceedings via video link from his prison cell. He was charged with murder, robbery, attempted robbery, and illegal possession of a weapon. On the murder charge, the maximum penalty was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court, given the severity of the crimes and the public outcry, decided to go beyond that punishment. As a result, Rudy Fleming was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, with an additional 30 years in prison for related offenses. This decision underscored the seriousness of his crime and sent a strong message against cruelty and crimes against society. A relationship that once seemed touching can turn into a prison where love turns into obsession. Lindsay Van Blanken, a talented artist with dark eyes and a soft smile, could never have guessed that the man she trusted would become her executioner. Her story is more than just a tragedy about love. It's a nightmare that began to form slowly, like a poisonous net, braiding her life. It began with the usual arguments, jealousy, and William's attempts to control Lindsay's every move. He couldn't stand the fact that she was trying to break free. Behind the blind obsession lurked something darker, the fear that she might be gone forever, and that fear soon turned into a lust for total control. When Lindsay disappeared, no one knew she was about to die at the hands of the man who swore he loved her. The police found her body in the basement, hidden amongst old junk, like a useless toy they decided to do away with. And the deeper the detectives dug, the more gruesome details came to the surface. William was not just a murderer, he was a cold-blooded manipulator whose sick love had drawn Lindsay into a death trap. It would be a long time before the investigation could put the pieces of this bloody puzzle together. But what drove William to kill? Was it a plan or a random flash of madness? Could it have been the voices in his head that whispered those gruesome orders to him? Answers slowly surfaced, but each new piece of evidence only served to confuse the case further. In 2016, the victim's backpack was found buried in an abandoned construction site a short walk from where the victim was found. Buried in the backpack were items with 40 bone fragments. Inside the backpack were a cell phone, credit card, and missing shoes. Most of the bones found belonged to animals, but 12 of them turned out to be human. Forensic scientists found that these bones originally belonged to bodies that were used to train medics. It is still unclear whether Will collected them because of his own strange predilections, and then just decided to get rid of them in order not to arouse additional suspicion from the police, or whether he conducted some kind of ritual under the influence of the voices in his head. However, it didn't end there. When questioned at the police station, Will told detectives that he had lost the gym bag before the victim went missing. He suggested that someone might have used the bag to frame him. However, no one believed this, and he did not appear to have a valid motive for the murder. Investigators then took the suspect to the basement where the body was found. They hoped that this place would arouse guilt in him, and he would confess to the crime. However, the guy surprisingly did not show any emotion. Apparently, the calculation of the police worked, because soon the criminal did crack. He said that shortly before Lindsay's disappearance, he began to hear voices in his head, which ordered him to get rid of his beloved. By May 2004, detectives had gathered enough evidence to arrest and charge William with murder. By this point, even more evidence had been obtained. One of Will's friends handed over Lindsay's second diary, which he had taken into safekeeping before Will was committed to a mental institution. Also providing valuable information was the perpetrator's father. He said that when he first watched the report on Lindsay's disappearance with his son, he admitted that he had lost his gym bag, although the news did not mention it. This struck the father as odd and caused him to think that Will had begun to build his defense strategy. In early November 2005, the case went to trial. It was decided that some of the evidence should not be shown to the jury, which led to arguments about which evidence should be excluded. For this reason, the hearing was stopped and rescheduled. The backpack is found, which means things aren't over yet. At this point, all the evidence once again leads to the main suspect. The prosecutor's office insisted that it was a cold-blooded and premeditated murder. An important piece of evidence was William's actions before the tragedy. He could not accept the breakup with Lindsay and began to stalk her. Evidence of his intimidation emerged in correspondence, and Lindsay's colleagues confirmed that they had had a serious argument a few hours before her disappearance. The investigation revealed that the crime scene, the basement, was not chosen at random. The couple had often spent time there before Lindsay started dating Brandon. This familiar place probably became a trap for the girl, where William lured her again. On the body of the criminal were found characteristic signs of struggle. His former lover desperately resisted before he finally got the upper hand. The cold-blooded criminal used cable ties to strangle Lindsay and then hid her body in a gym bag. He dumped the bag in the basement and covered it with old furniture and junk, counting on no one noticing what had happened. The worst part is that after all this, William did not change his behavior. That same evening, he calmly performed at a music concert, playing the cello as if nothing had happened. Not the slightest sign of regret, as if life continued as normal for him. Even though a lot of evidence had been gathered against William, prosecutors still had doubts whether they could convince the jury to the end. However, in December 2005, the jury reached a verdict. William was convicted, and for many, it meant the end of a horrifying story. But in reality, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that was more gruesome and unpredictable. Will was the first to provide information about Lindsay the night she didn't come home, and immediately aroused the suspicions of relatives. According to him, they met by chance at the train station and walked part of the way together just talking. The former lovers allegedly had a nice chat and parted outside a pub near Lindsay's home. He then left and never saw her again. However, during the conversation, Will suddenly began to justify himself, saying that he did not kill Lindsay, which sounded strange, as no one accused him of anything, because at that time no one even thought about the death of the girl. This alerted Lindsay's sister, who just wanted to know if he had any information. After this conversation, the relatives immediately went to the police and shared their suspicions. Detectives decided to question Will. On November 26, 2003, he was taken to the police station where he repeated the same story that he had told his sister Lindsay. The police asked Will to provide DNA samples, fingerprints, and allowed him to be examined for injuries. He agreed voluntarily. The police found scratches on his arms and chest, to which Will explained that those marks were left by his pets, rats he kept in his room by the dozens. He also mentioned that he had recently fallen off a skateboard. Despite these excuses, the detectives grew suspicious of his involvement in Lindsay's disappearance, as the scratches could have been the result of a struggle with a victim who resisted. However, at that point there was no hard evidence or testimony against Will, so he was released. By this point, the search operation had been going on for several days. Divers surveyed local bodies of water, volunteers scoured parks and forests. Lindsay's disappearance was all over the news, with images and descriptions of her posted all over the city. Police were reviewing surveillance footage of Lindsay's route home in an attempt to find any trace of her. At the same time, law enforcement officials interviewed anyone who knew the girl. Thus, they came to one of her colleagues, whose name was not disclosed for security reasons. He said that that day, after finishing work, he saw a young man he did not know meet Lindsay on the street. It was definitely not her fiancé whom he had seen earlier. A heated argument ensued between Lindsay and this guy. After the horrifying discovery in 2016, it seemed like the Lindsay Van Blanken case would forever be remembered as an example of cold and calculated crime. But every criminal isn't just a crime. It's a story that begins long before the fateful denouement. To understand what led to this tragedy, we need to go back to the very beginning. to the relationship that at first seemed like ordinary love and then turned into a deadly game. Let's step back and get to know Lindsay and William. How did their paths cross? What caused their relationship to go beyond the boundaries of normalcy and ultimately lead to a horrifying tragedy? Let's find out how these two destinies intertwined and how a simple love turned into a deadly obsession. In 1985, Lindsay Van Blanken was born in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. Her parents' names were Ron and Cynthia. They already had an older daughter, Louise, and there was a warm atmosphere in family life. Lindsay stood out from early childhood for her shyness, kindness, and innate artistry. During her childhood years, her special interest in art manifested itself in a passion for drawing and creating animations. Lindsay had her own art journal, where she was constantly sketching new characters and ideas that sprang from her imagination. As she grew older, Lindsay dreamed of a career as an artist, and her ambition was fueled by natural talent. However, while she was still in middle school, her parents' marital happiness began to crack at the seams. Divorce became inevitable, and the children were left to live with their mother. Despite the changes in the family, Lindsay and her sister Louise continued to keep in touch with their father. In April 2001, Lindsay's life underwent a new change. Her mother, Cynthia, remarried, this time to a man named David. He immediately found a common language with the children, showing friendliness and calmness. On the day of the wedding, Lindsay was 16 years old, and she supported her mother's decision, happily accepting the new member of the family. It was at this wedding that Lindsay met William Garrett Matheson. He was a few years older than her and came to the event as a member of the string orchestra. William was a cello virtuoso, and his skill immediately caught young Lindsay's attention. After an admiring conversation at the wedding and meeting Lindsay's best friend, Jocelyn, a spark developed between the two. The evening ended with them exchanging phone numbers. From that point on, Lindsay and William began actively communicating online and then began spending time together. Their relationship developed rapidly, especially due to the fact that they lived not far from each other. Lindsay and her family lived in the Sydney suburb of Queen's Park, just 10 minutes away from William's home where he lived with his parents. The relationship between Lindsay and William, which began as a friendship, quickly developed into a romantic connection. Initially, Lindsay preferred to hide her feelings from her family because William was unusual and dressed extravagantly, which caused her a certain embarrassment. However, over time, she admitted to her parents that she was dating him. Despite the fact that William was a few years older than her, Lindsay didn't let that get in the way of her feelings. Her first love ignited in her heart and completely consumed her. Caring parents began to notice a change in their daughter's behavior. Lindsay, who used to be quiet and homely, now often disappeared in the late evenings to spend time with William. These late-night visits, which sometimes lasted into the morning, were a noticeable change in her behavior. Her parents also noticed that her formerly quiet and peaceful evenings had changed to rowdy parties and late-night outings. It quickly became apparent that Lindsay and William became frequent visitors to parks and even cemeteries, which William loved to visit. She also began to change in appearance. Her closet became dominated by dark, gothic pieces, reflecting her boyfriend's preferences. These drastic changes did not go unnoticed, and her parents began to worry. They began to suspect that William might be manipulating Lindsay, controlling her, and imposing his interests. The changes affected not only her appearance and preference for places to go for walks, but also her speech. Lindsay began to use new, uncharacteristic expressions, indicating her attempt to adjust to William. These changes in behavior and appearance suggested that their relationship may have been more complicated than it appeared at first glance. Lindsay has always been a symbol of good-naturedness and creativity. Her bright energy and cheerfulness radiated from her every work, especially when her work won first place at the Young Talent Show. Her ability to create colorful and interesting characters drew attention and admiration. Against the background of her sunny nature, William Matheson presented a complete contrast. His hobbies were dark and gloomy, and his interest in psychopaths and murderers only emphasized his sinister nature. William was known for his eccentricities, including an affinity for rats, which he bred in his room and allowed to roam freely throughout the dwelling. His musical preferences included dark and often violent compositions that touched on themes of violence and pain. Unexpectedly, Lindsay began to adopt William's habits. She began listening to the same dark music, wearing dark and extravagant outfits, and even began to speak and think like her boyfriend. These changes in behavior and style did not go unnoticed, and those around her began to express concern. However, Lindsay brushed off their questions, claiming that she was just experimenting with style and looking for herself. Despite all the external changes, Lindsay continued to do her favorite thing, painting. She shared her work on the internet, where her creativity found support from many friends. Here, among people with similar interests, be it animation or video games, she met Brandon Leonard. They first met in 2002. Like William, Brandon was older than Lindsay and lived in Seattle, USA. Despite the distance, a friendship quickly developed between them. They started texting each other daily, playing video games and video chatting. Gradually, their relationship grew into more than just friendship. Lindsay realized that her relationship with William Matheson no longer brought her joy. Each day, her bond with Brandon grew stronger, and her inner comfort with him was incomparable. Soon, she began to realize that she wanted to end her relationship with William. Gradually, her meetings with him became less and less frequent, and Lindsay tried to avoid him. Despite her attempts to gradually hint at a breakup, her fear of William's reaction kept her in suspense. He had repeatedly threatened to take his own life in the event of a breakup, and these threats terrified Lindsay. She felt trapped by a manipulative man who was trying to bind her to him. Nevertheless, Lindsay continued to try to distance herself from William, hoping that the feelings would eventually fade and he would pull away. Perhaps her inexperience and fear of her first breakup prevented her from acting decisively. She shared her feelings with her loved ones, confessing that she was afraid of the final breakup, but realized that it was impossible to continue this relationship. While Lindsay struggled with this internal conflict, her relationship with Brandon continued to strengthen. Every day they talked, video called, and supported each other. Lindsay's parents noticed that she was returning to her positive lifestyle. She started wearing brightly colored clothes again, listening to fun music, and acting natural without having to adjust to anyone. Meanwhile, Lindsay took a step toward her dream. She had always been drawn to a career as an artist and applied to Walt Disney Animation Studios based in Sydney. Her work did not go unnoticed, and Lindsay received an invitation for an interview. She was filled with excitement and joy as her dream began to come true. Despite the storm of emotions, Lindsay found her strength and came to Walt Disney Studios. After a successful interview, she was offered a position as an artist in residence. Thanks to her exceptional talent, she quickly stood out among hundreds of other applicants. The joy and pride of her family, friends, and of course Brandon, who was thousands of miles away from her, was boundless. A few days later, Brandon, though they had not yet met in person, proposed to Lindsay. While in Seattle, he couldn't contain his feelings, and 18-year-old Lindsay said yes. The couple became remotely engaged, and it was the initial step towards their future together. Brandon began preparing for the big trip from Seattle to Sydney to finally meet his fiancée and build a life together. The first meeting went great, and Lindsay was happy. However, she was left with one unresolved problem: William Matheson. She hadn't officially broken up with him yet, and the only thing holding her back was his threat of suicide, which he had made repeatedly. Lindsay hoped that more distance and infrequent communication would fix the problem. She was sure that Will's feelings had faded over time, and he was living his life. Unfortunately, Lindsay was wrong. William didn't understand why their relationship had ended and kept expecting things to go back to the way they were. When Lindsay realized this, she had to announce the breakup directly and decisively. To make her decision more convincing, she revealed that she was engaged to someone else and was preparing to get married. This news shocked William, who could not quietly let go of his former lover. The loss of control over the situation was a heavy blow for him, and his reaction promised to be unpredictable. To deal with the situation, William decided to arrange a showdown and came to Lindsay's house, choosing the moment when her fiancé Brandon was also there. A loud scandal broke out on the doorstep. William was not ceremonious in expressions, bombarding Lindsay and Brandon with a stream of accusations. He claimed that Lindsay had allegedly cheated on both of them, trying to convince Brandon that their affair had been going on before they met. Although it was a lie, William hoped to cause jealousy and destroy their relationship. Lindsay, despite the stress, was able to convince Brandon that their relationship with William ended long ago, and she had been faithful to him from the beginning. But that didn't solve the problem. William refused to let Lindsay go. His manipulative tendencies and resentment over his loss of control led him to stalk her. He followed her every move, filling her life with fear and discomfort. Lindsay quickly realized that William continued to control her life and was terrified of what was happening. Despite the difficulties, Brandon supported her through everything, and their relationship continued to grow. Lindsay strongly suggested that they accelerate their wedding plans, hoping that formalizing their union would get William behind them. The couple decided that the best way to get away from the stalker was to move to the United States to join Brandon's family. There, on the new continent, William would not be able to find them. They began to prepare for the move and planned a trip to Seattle for Christmas. Lindsay was nervous about meeting Brandon's family, but was determined to start a new life and put the past behind her. Unfortunately, the happy dream of a new life was shattered by a fateful accident. Just a month before Christmas, on November 24th, 2003, 18-year-old artist Lindsay went missing. It happened after finishing her workday at an animation studio. Lindsay left the studio at 5:30 p.m., intending to return home on the train that took her daily to Bondi Junction Station in Sydney. From there, she usually walked to her home in Queen's Park. That evening, however, Lindsay never returned. Brandon was in deep distress. He repeatedly tried to call Lindsay and sent her messages, but received no response. Soon, his concern compelled him to contact Lindsay's parents. Cynthia and her stepfather, David, began to panic, but at first they hoped Lindsay was just late for work. It wasn't until the next morning that they decided to go to the police. Brandon spent the night waiting for Lindsay to return and explain her disappearance with a delay, but it didn't happen. On the morning of November 25th, 2003, Brandon went to the police station and reported Lindsay missing. Investigators contacted her family, who confirmed that this behavior was completely uncharacteristic of Lindsay. She never stayed at work unannounced and always called if something was going wrong. The detectives on the case quickly learned of Lindsay's difficult breakup with her ex-boyfriend, which increased the risk and indicated a possible threat. It was therefore decided to find the missing person as quickly as possible. The police reached out to the public through the media in an attempt to publicize the case and find witnesses. Lindsay's family also went on television appealing for help and started calling all her friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. One of the first people they contacted was her ex-boyfriend, William Matheson. Hours after Lindsay's disappearance, police officers discovered that the last person to see her was a suspicious stranger. To determine his identity, law enforcement showed William's photo to her co-workers. His appearance left no doubt, and he was quickly recognized. This increased the suspicion against him, but there was still no concrete evidence against him. 2 weeks passed, and hopes of finding Lindsay alive were fading fast. Detectives' attention focused on her ex-boyfriend. On December 7th, 2003, William happened to come to the attention of the police when a patrol was looking for a vagrant on a local report. Will was apprehended, and a search of his backpack found a suspicious array of items. Lots of food tape, latex gloves, several bottles of disinfectants, candles, 2 knives, scissors, and some water he called holy. Police officers were disturbed by the finds and tried to find out what William planned to do with the items. According to him, he was going to have a picnic in a local park. But why would he bring cleaning supplies, knives, and other items if the purpose of the visit was to relax in nature? Will's answer sounded strange and illogical. The patrol did not arrest him, but checked his name in the database and learned of his possible involvement in Lindsay's disappearance. It was decided to follow him, assuming that he might have been holding the girl hostage and thus give them a chance of finding her. However, William sensed that he was being followed and returned home, leaving the police with no new clues. There was no information about the missing Lindsay for nearly 7 weeks until the police station received an alarming call on January 10, 2004, from a maintenance technician at an apartment building on Queen's Park Road. Residents of the complex complained of a terrible odor coming from the basement, and the technician was called in to inspect it. However, he encountered a difficulty. The door was blocked from the inside. After overcoming the obstruction, he squeezed through the narrow opening and found that the door was pinned by a mattress, and the basement itself was full of trash and quite cluttered. Assuming that some animal may have died in the basement, the technician began an inspection. He removed a considerable amount of trash until he came across a large gym bag in the corner. The bag was very heavy and the zipper was jammed. The technician cut it open with a knife and a human arm fell out onto the floor. Inside were badly decomposed remains that emitted a horrible odor. The technician immediately called the police. Officers arrived and determined that it was the body of a woman with obvious signs of a violent death. She had been bagged and dumped in the basement among the trash. Detectives who investigated the scene had little doubt that it was the missing Lindsay, as the clothing on the body matched the clothes the girl was wearing on the day she disappeared. However, the condition of the remains required further identification. Dental records confirmed that the body found was that of an 18-year-old artist, and her parents recognized their daughter's clothing. On the day of Lindsay's disappearance, she had a black backpack containing a cell phone and a pair of spare shoes for work. After the crime, those items went missing. All the facts pointed to Will Matheson. He was the last person to see Lindsay alive and had a motive. However, hard evidence was needed to arrest and charge him. By then, it was revealed that the prime suspect was being treated in a psychiatric hospital. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenic spectrum disorder with obsessive suicidal thoughts, making it difficult for him to communicate with the police and complicating the investigation. Investigators focused on gathering evidence that could link Will to the crime. The main object of interest was the gym bag in which the body was found. If it could be proven that William Matheson owned this bag or purchased it specifically to cover up the crime, it could be important evidence in a court of law. Detectives began working on this aspect of the case. They determined that such a bag was rare and was only sold in one store in the city. This model was unique because it was brought in for test sale. This made it easier to find information about the purchase. It turned out that the bag was bought by a certain young man on November 22, 2003 at about 1:30 p.m., paying in cash. However, the lack of CCTV cameras in the store made further investigation difficult. Detectives requested footage from nearby cameras and discovered that a young man, who looked very similar to William, had moved towards the store a few minutes before purchasing the bag. However, the camera did not capture him leaving the store with the purchase. He may have exited and headed in a different direction to avoid being caught in the frame. This could indicate that he was trying to evade the cameras to avoid being caught for his crime. Fortunately, help came from Will's parents. His father remembered that his son came home with that very bag on November 22nd. This allowed investigators to obtain a search warrant and conduct a sweep of the suspect's home. During the search, police focused on Will's bedroom, where they found several disturbing pieces of evidence. Among them were Lindsay's diary and a stack of newspaper clippings about the missing girl that Will had collected as macabre trophies. Such collections are common among criminals. The most frightening find were the tape recordings in which Will spoke of Lindsay in the past tense, clearly indicating that he knew of her death before it was known to others. This, unfortunately, he also informed Lindsay's sister. In addition, a song recorded sometime after Lindsay's disappearance was found on Will's cell phone. Although the lyrics did not contain names, they clearly hinted at the commission of a crime. After 2 months in a psychiatric hospital, Will was released, and investigators finally had a chance to interview him and answer questions that plagued everyone in the county, including the victim's family and fiancé. In the end, a jury found William guilty of premeditated murder of Lindsay on June 15, 2004, a talented and inspiring artist whose life was tragically cut short. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. After 19 years behind bars, William was released on parole. This moment came as a real blow to Lindsay's family and everyone who knew her. Although the court ruled that his parole petition was worthy of consideration, fears about his possible threat to the public remained unquenchable. William will face strict supervision until 2029, total supervision, psychiatric treatment, and regular checkups. But will these measures really protect society from possible danger? Will someone who has already broken lives once and left deep wounds be able to be a part of society again? Or will his dark sides come to the surface again? The questions remain open, and fear of the future continues to plague those who were close to the victim, leaving them in a state of constant anxiety. A relationship that once seemed touching can turn into a prison where love turns into obsession. Lindsay Van Blanken, a talented artist with dark eyes and a soft smile, could never have guessed that the man she trusted would become her executioner. Her story is more than just a tragedy about love. It's a nightmare that began to form slowly, like a poisonous net, braiding her life. It began with the usual arguments, jealousy, and William's attempts to control Lindsay's every move. He couldn't stand the fact that she was trying to break free. Behind the blind obsession lurked something darker, the fear that she might be gone forever, and that fear soon turned into a lust for total control. When Lindsay disappeared, no one knew she was about to die at the hands of the man who swore he loved her. The police found her body in the basement, hidden amongst old junk, like a useless toy they decided to do away with. And the deeper the detectives dug, the more gruesome details came to the surface. William was not just a murderer, he was a cold-blooded manipulator whose sick love had drawn Lindsay into a death trap. It would be a long time before the investigation could put the pieces of this bloody puzzle together. But what drove William to kill? Was it a plan or a random flash of madness? Could it have been the voices in his head that whispered those gruesome orders to him? Answers slowly surfaced, but each new piece of evidence only served to confuse the case further. In 2016, the victim's backpack was found buried in an abandoned construction site a short walk from where the victim was found. Buried in the backpack were items with 40 bone fragments. Inside the backpack were a cell phone, credit card, and missing shoes. Most of the bones found belonged to animals, but 12 of them turned out to be human. Forensic scientists found that these bones originally belonged to bodies that were used to train medics. It is still unclear whether Will collected them because of his own strange predilections, and then just decided to get rid of them in order not to arouse additional suspicion from the police, or whether he conducted some kind of ritual under the influence of the voices in his head. However, it didn't end there. When questioned at the police station, Will told detectives that he had lost the gym bag before the victim went missing. He suggested that someone might have used the bag to frame him. However, no one believed this, and he did not appear to have a valid motive for the murder. Investigators then took the suspect to the basement where the body was found. They hoped that this place would arouse guilt in him, and he would confess to the crime. However, the guy surprisingly did not show any emotion. Apparently, the calculation of the police worked, because soon the criminal did crack. He said that shortly before Lindsay's disappearance, he began to hear voices in his head, which ordered him to get rid of his beloved. By May 2004, detectives had gathered enough evidence to arrest and charge William with murder. By this point, even more evidence had been obtained. One of Will's friends handed over Lindsay's second diary, which he had taken into safekeeping before Will was committed to a mental institution. Also providing valuable information was the perpetrator's father. He said that when he first watched the report on Lindsay's disappearance with his son, he admitted that he had lost his gym bag, although the news did not mention it. This struck the father as odd and caused him to think that Will had begun to build his defense strategy. In early November 2005, the case went to trial. It was decided that some of the evidence should not be shown to the jury, which led to arguments about which evidence should be excluded. For this reason, the hearing was stopped and rescheduled. The backpack is found, which means things aren't over yet. At this point, all the evidence once again leads to the main suspect. The prosecutor's office insisted that it was a cold-blooded and premeditated murder. An important piece of evidence was William's actions before the tragedy. He could not accept the breakup with Lindsay and began to stalk her. Evidence of his intimidation emerged in correspondence, and Lindsay's colleagues confirmed that they had had a serious argument a few hours before her disappearance. The investigation revealed that the crime scene, the basement, was not chosen at random. The couple had often spent time there before Lindsay started dating Brandon. This familiar place probably became a trap for the girl, where William lured her again. On the body of the criminal were found characteristic signs of struggle. His former lover desperately resisted before he finally got the upper hand. The cold-blooded criminal used cable ties to strangle Lindsay and then hid her body in a gym bag. He dumped the bag in the basement and covered it with old furniture and junk, counting on no one noticing what had happened. The worst part is that after all this, William did not change his behavior. That same evening, he calmly performed at a music concert, playing the cello as if nothing had happened. Not the slightest sign of regret, as if life continued as normal for him. Even though a lot of evidence had been gathered against William, prosecutors still had doubts whether they could convince the jury to the end. However, in December 2005, the jury reached a verdict. William was convicted, and for many, it meant the end of a horrifying story. But in reality, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that was more gruesome and unpredictable. Will was the first to provide information about Lindsay the night she didn't come home, and immediately aroused the suspicions of relatives. According to him, they met by chance at the train station and walked part of the way together just talking. The former lovers allegedly had a nice chat and parted outside a pub near Lindsay's home. He then left and never saw her again. However, during the conversation, Will suddenly began to justify himself, saying that he did not kill Lindsay, which sounded strange, as no one accused him of anything, because at that time no one even thought about the death of the girl. This alerted Lindsay's sister, who just wanted to know if he had any information. After this conversation, the relatives immediately went to the police and shared their suspicions. Detectives decided to question Will. On November 26, 2003, he was taken to the police station where he repeated the same story that he had told his sister Lindsay. The police asked Will to provide DNA samples, fingerprints, and allowed him to be examined for injuries. He agreed voluntarily. The police found scratches on his arms and chest, to which Will explained that those marks were left by his pets, rats he kept in his room by the dozens. He also mentioned that he had recently fallen off a skateboard. Despite these excuses, the detectives grew suspicious of his involvement in Lindsay's disappearance, as the scratches could have been the result of a struggle with a victim who resisted. However, at that point there was no hard evidence or testimony against Will, so he was released. By this point, the search operation had been going on for several days. Divers surveyed local bodies of water, volunteers scoured parks and forests. Lindsay's disappearance was all over the news, with images and descriptions of her posted all over the city. Police were reviewing surveillance footage of Lindsay's route home in an attempt to find any trace of her. At the same time, law enforcement officials interviewed anyone who knew the girl. Thus, they came to one of her colleagues, whose name was not disclosed for security reasons. He said that that day, after finishing work, he saw a young man he did not know meet Lindsay on the street. It was definitely not her fiancé whom he had seen earlier. A heated argument ensued between Lindsay and this guy. After the horrifying discovery in 2016, it seemed like the Lindsay Van Blanken case would forever be remembered as an example of cold and calculated crime. But every criminal isn't just a crime. It's a story that begins long before the fateful denouement. To understand what led to this tragedy, we need to go back to the very beginning, to the relationship that at first seemed like ordinary love and then turned into a deadly game. Let's step back and get to know Lindsay and William. How did their paths cross? What caused their relationship to go beyond the boundaries of normalcy and ultimately lead to a horrifying tragedy? Let's find out how these two destinies intertwined and how a simple love turned into a deadly obsession. In 1985, Lindsay Van Blanken was born in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. Her parents' names were Ron and Cynthia. They already had an older daughter, Louise, and there was a warm atmosphere in family life. Lindsay stood out from early childhood for her shyness, kindness, and innate artistry. During her childhood years, her special interest in art manifested itself in a passion for drawing and creating animations. Lindsay had her own art journal, where she was constantly sketching new characters and ideas that sprang from her imagination. As she grew older, Lindsay dreamed of a career as an artist, and her ambition was fueled by natural talent. However, while she was still in middle school, her parents' marital happiness began to crack at the seams. Divorce became inevitable, and the children were left to live with their mother. Despite the changes in the family, Lindsay and her sister Louise continued to keep in touch with their father. In April 2001, Lindsay's life underwent a new change. Her mother, Cynthia, remarried, this time to a man named David. He immediately found a common language with the children, showing friendliness and calmness. On the day of the wedding, Lindsay was 16 years old, and she supported her mother's decision, happily accepting the new member of the family. It was at this wedding that Lindsay met William Garrett Matheson. He was a few years older than her and came to the event as a member of the string orchestra. William was a cello virtuoso, and his skill immediately caught young Lindsay's attention. After an admiring conversation at the wedding and meeting Lindsay's best friend, Jocelyn, a spark developed between the two. The evening ended with them exchanging phone numbers. From that point on, Lindsay and William began actively communicating online and then began spending time together. Their relationship developed rapidly, especially due to the fact that they lived not far from each other. Lindsay and her family lived in the Sydney suburb of Queen's Park, just 10 minutes away from William's home where he lived with his parents. The relationship between Lindsay and William which began as a friendship, quickly developed into a romantic connection. Initially, Lindsay preferred to hide her feelings from her family because William was unusual and dressed extravagantly, which caused her a certain embarrassment. However, over time, she admitted to her parents that she was dating him. Despite the fact that William was a few years older than her, Lindsay didn't let that get in the way of her feelings. Her first love ignited in her heart and completely consumed her. Caring parents began to notice a change in their daughter's behavior. Lindsay, who used to be quiet and homely, now often disappeared in the late evenings to spend time with William. These late-night visits, which sometimes lasted into the morning, were a noticeable change in her behavior. Her parents also noticed that her formerly quiet and peaceful evenings had changed to rowdy parties and late-night outings. It quickly became apparent that Lindsay and William became frequent visitors to parks and even cemeteries, which William loved to visit. She also began to change in appearance. Her closet became dominated by dark, gothic pieces, reflecting her boyfriend's preferences. These drastic changes did not go unnoticed, and her parents began to worry. They began to suspect that William might be manipulating Lindsay, controlling her, and imposing his interests. The changes affected not only her appearance and preference for places to go for walks, but also her speech. Lindsay began to use new, uncharacteristic expressions, indicating her attempt to adjust to William. These changes in behavior and appearance suggested that their relationship may have been more complicated than it appeared at first glance. Lindsay has always been a symbol of good-naturedness and creativity. Her bright energy and cheerfulness radiated from her every work, especially when her work won first place at the Young Talent Show. Her ability to create colorful and interesting characters drew attention and admiration. Against the background of her sunny nature, William Matheson presented a complete contrast. His hobbies were dark and gloomy, and his interest in psychopaths and murderers only emphasized his sinister nature. William was known for his eccentricities, including an affinity for rats, which he bred in his room and allowed to roam freely throughout the dwelling. His musical preferences included dark and often violent compositions that touched on themes of violence and pain. Unexpectedly, Lindsay began to adopt William's habits. She began listening to the same dark music, wearing dark and extravagant outfits, and even began to speak and think like her boyfriend. These changes in behavior and style did not go unnoticed, and those around her began to express concern. However, Lindsay brushed off their questions, claiming that she was just experimenting with style and looking for herself. Despite all the external changes, Lindsay continued to do her favorite thing, painting. She shared her work on the internet, where her creativity found support from many friends. Here, among people with similar interests, be it animation or video games, she met Brandon Leonard. They first met in 2002. Like William, Brandon was older than Lindsay and lived in Seattle, USA. Despite the distance, a friendship quickly developed between them. They started texting each other daily, playing video games and video chatting. Gradually, their relationship grew into more than just friendship. Lindsay realized that her relationship with William Matheson no longer brought her joy. Each day, her bond with Brandon grew stronger, and her inner comfort with him was incomparable. Soon, she began to realize that she wanted to end her relationship with William. Gradually, her meetings with him became less and less frequent, and Lindsay tried to avoid him. Despite her attempts to gradually hint at a breakup, her fear of William's reaction kept her in suspense. He had repeatedly threatened to take his own life in the event of a breakup, and these threats terrified Lindsay. She felt trapped by a manipulative man who was trying to bind her to him. Nevertheless, Lindsay continued to try to distance herself from William, hoping that the feelings would eventually fade and he would pull away. Perhaps her inexperience and fear of her first breakup prevented her from acting decisively. She shared her feelings with her loved ones, confessing that she was afraid of the final breakup, but realized that it was impossible to continue this relationship. While Lindsay struggled with this internal conflict, her relationship with Brandon continued to strengthen. Every day they talked, video called, and supported each other. Lindsay's parents noticed that she was returning to her positive lifestyle. She started wearing brightly colored clothes again, listening to fun music, and acting natural without having to adjust to anyone. Meanwhile, Lindsay took a step toward her dream. She had always been drawn to a career as an artist and applied to Walt Disney Animation Studios based in Sydney. Her work did not go unnoticed, and Lindsay received an invitation for an interview. She was filled with excitement and joy as her dream began to come true. Despite the storm of emotions, Lindsay found her strength and came to Walt Disney Studios. After a successful interview, she was offered a position as an artist in residence. Thanks to her exceptional talent, she quickly stood out among hundreds of other applicants. The joy and pride of her family, friends, and of course Brandon, who was thousands of miles away from her, was boundless. A few days later, Brandon, though they had not yet met in person, proposed to Lindsay. While in Seattle, he couldn't contain his feelings, and 18-year-old Lindsay said yes. The couple became remotely engaged, and it was the initial step towards their future together. Brandon began preparing for the big trip from Seattle to Sydney to finally meet his fiancée and build a life together. The first meeting went great, and Lindsay was happy. However, she was left with one unresolved problem: William Matheson. She hadn't officially broken up with him yet, and the only thing holding her back was his threat of suicide, which he had made repeatedly. Lindsay hoped that more distance and infrequent communication would fix the problem. She was sure that Will's feelings had faded over time, and he was living his life. Unfortunately, Lindsay was wrong. William didn't understand why their relationship had ended and kept expecting things to go back to the way they were. When Lindsay realized this, she had to announce the breakup directly and decisively. To make her decision more convincing, she revealed that she was engaged to someone else and was preparing to get married. This news shocked William, who could not quietly let go of his former lover. The loss of control over the situation was a heavy blow for him, and his reaction promised to be unpredictable. To deal with the situation, William decided to arrange a showdown and came to Lindsay's house, choosing the moment when her fiancé Brandon was also there. A loud scandal broke out on the doorstep. William was not ceremonious in expressions, bombarding Lindsay and Brandon with a stream of accusations. He claimed that Lindsay had allegedly cheated on both of them, trying to convince Brandon that their affair had been going on before they met. Although it was a lie, William hoped to cause jealousy and destroy their relationship. Lindsay, despite the stress, was able to convince Brandon that their relationship with William ended long ago, and she had been faithful to him from the beginning. But that didn't solve the problem. William refused to let Lindsay go. His manipulative tendencies and resentment over his loss of control led him to stalk her. He followed her every move, filling her life with fear and discomfort. Lindsay quickly realized that William continued to control her life and was terrified of what was happening. Despite the difficulties, Brandon supported her through everything, and their relationship continued to grow. Lindsay strongly suggested that they accelerate their wedding plans, hoping that formalizing their union would get William behind them. The couple decided that the best way to get away from the stalker was to move to the United States to join Brandon's family. There, on the new continent, William would not be able to find them. They began to prepare for the move and planned a trip to Seattle for Christmas. Lindsay was nervous about meeting Brandon's family, but was determined to start a new life and put the past behind her. Unfortunately, the happy dream of a new life was shattered by a fateful accident. Just a month before Christmas, on November 24th, 2003, 18-year-old artist Lindsay went missing. It happened after finishing her workday at an animation studio. Lindsay left the studio at 5:30 p.m., intending to return home on the train that took her daily to Bondi Junction Station in Sydney. From there, she usually walked to her home in Queen's Park. That evening, however, Lindsay never returned. Brandon was in deep distress. He repeatedly tried to call Lindsay and sent her messages, but received no response. Soon, his concern compelled him to contact Lindsay's parents. Cynthia and her stepfather, David, began to panic, but at first they hoped Lindsay was just late for work. It wasn't until the next morning that they decided to go to the police. Brandon spent the night waiting for Lindsay to return and explain her disappearance with a delay, but it didn't happen. On the morning of November 25th, 2003, Brandon went to the police station and reported Lindsay missing. Investigators contacted her family, who confirmed that this behavior was completely uncharacteristic of Lindsay. She never stayed at work unannounced and always called if something was going wrong. The detectives on the case quickly learned of Lindsay's difficult breakup with her ex-boyfriend, which increased the risk and indicated a possible threat. It was therefore decided to find the missing person as quickly as possible. The police reached out to the public through the media in an attempt to publicize the case and find witnesses. Lindsay's family also went on television appealing for help and started calling all her friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. One of the first people they contacted was her ex-boyfriend William Matheson. Hours after Lindsay's disappearance, police officers discovered that the last person to see her was a suspicious stranger. To determine his identity, law enforcement showed William's photo to her co-workers. His appearance left no doubt, and he was quickly recognized. This increased the suspicion against him. But there was still no concrete evidence against him. 2 weeks passed, and hopes of finding Lindsay alive were fading fast. Detectives' attention focused on her ex-boyfriend. On December 7, 2003, William happened to come to the attention of the police when a patrol was looking for a vagrant on a local report. Will was apprehended, and a search of his backpack found a suspicious array of items. Lots of food tape, latex gloves, several bottles of disinfectants, candles, 2 knives, scissors, and some water he called holy. Police officers were disturbed by the finds and tried to find out what William planned to do with the items. According to him, he was going to have a picnic in a local park. But why would he bring cleaning supplies, knives, and other items if the purpose of the visit was to relax in nature? Will's answer sounded strange and illogical. The patrol did not arrest him, but checked his name in the database and learned of his possible involvement in Lindsay's disappearance. It was decided to follow him, assuming that he might have been holding the girl hostage and thus give them a chance of finding her. However, William sensed that he was being followed and returned home, leaving the police with no new clues. There was no information about the missing Lindsay for nearly 7 weeks until the police station received an alarming call on January 10, 2004, from a maintenance technician at an apartment building on Queens Park Road. Residents of the complex complained of a terrible odor coming from the basement, and the technician was called in to inspect it. However, he encountered a difficulty. The door was blocked from the inside. After overcoming the obstruction, he squeezed through the narrow opening and found that the door was pinned by a mattress, and the basement itself was full of trash and quite cluttered. Assuming that some animal may have died in the basement, the technician began an inspection. He removed a considerable amount of trash until he came across a large gym bag in the corner. The bag was very heavy and the zipper was jammed. The technician cut it open with a knife and a human arm fell out onto the floor. Inside were badly decomposed remains that emitted a horrible odor. The technician immediately called the police. Officers arrived and determined that it was the body of a woman with obvious signs of a violent death. She had been bagged and dumped in the basement among the trash. Detectives who investigated the scene had little doubt that it was the missing Lindsay, as the clothing on the body matched the clothes the girl was wearing on the day she disappeared. However, the condition of the remains required further identification. Dental records confirmed that the body found was that of an 18-year-old artist, and her parents recognized their daughter's clothing. On the day of Lindsay's disappearance, she had a black backpack containing a cell phone and a pair of spare shoes for work. After the crime, those items went missing. All the facts pointed to Will Matheson. He was the last person to see Lindsay alive and had a motive. However, hard evidence was needed to arrest and charge him. By then, it was revealed that the prime suspect was being treated in a psychiatric hospital. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenic spectrum disorder with obsessive suicidal thoughts, making it difficult for him to communicate with the police and complicating the investigation. Investigators focused on gathering evidence that could link Will to the crime. The main object of interest was the gym bag in which the body was found. If it could be proven that William Matheson owned this bag or purchased it specifically to cover up the crime, it could be important evidence in a court of law. Detectives began working on this aspect of the case. They determined that such a bag was rare and was only sold in one store in the city. This model was unique because it was brought in for test sale. This made it easier to find information about the purchase. It turned out that the bag was bought by a certain young man on November 22, 2003 at about 1:30 p.m., paying in cash. However, the lack of CCTV cameras in the store made further investigation difficult. Detectives requested footage from nearby cameras and discovered that a young man, who looked very similar to William, had moved towards the store a few minutes before purchasing the bag. However, the camera did not capture him leaving the store with the purchase. He may have exited and headed in a different direction to avoid being caught in the frame. This could indicate that he was trying to evade the cameras to avoid being caught for his crime. Fortunately, help came from Will's parents. His father remembered that his son came home with that very bag on November 22nd. This allowed investigators to obtain a search warrant and conduct a sweep of the suspect's home. During the search, police focused on Will's bedroom, where they found several disturbing pieces of evidence. Among them were Lindsay's diary and a stack of newspaper clippings about the missing girl that Will had collected as macabre trophies. Such collections are common among criminals. The most frightening find were the tape recordings in which Will spoke of Lindsay in the past tense, clearly indicating that he knew of her death before it was known to others. This, unfortunately, he also informed Lindsay's sister. In addition, a song recorded sometime after Lindsay's disappearance was found on Will's cell phone. Although the lyrics did not contain names, they clearly hinted at the commission of a crime. After 2 months in a psychiatric hospital, Will was released, and investigators finally had a chance to interview him and answer questions that plagued everyone in the county, including the victim's family and fiancé. In the end, a jury found William guilty of premeditated murder of Lindsay on June 15, 2004, a talented and inspiring artist whose life was tragically cut short. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. After 19 years behind bars, William was released on parole. This moment came as a real blow to Lindsay's family and everyone who knew her. Although the court ruled that his parole petition was worthy of consideration, fears about his possible threat to the public remained unquenchable. William will face strict supervision until 2029, total supervision, psychiatric treatment, and regular checkups. But will these measures really protect society from possible danger? Will someone who has already broken lives once and left deep wounds be able to be a part of society again? Or will his dark sides come to the surface again? The questions remain open, and fear of the future continues to plague those who were close to the victim, leaving them in a state of constant anxiety. Sometimes kindness becomes the knife you drive into your own heart. We believe in the good in people, we trust, help, and try to save them. But sometimes this blind faith in the idea of redemption creates monsters. That's exactly what happened to Harold, a successful businessman and upstanding citizen who decided to offer a helping hand to a young woman with a troubled past. He had no idea that his kindness would spark a bloody tragedy. Sarah McLean, fragile, quiet, and seemingly timid on the outside, hid a darkness that had been growing inside her for years. Those around her only saw the surface and had no clue that inside, Sarah harbored thoughts that would send chills down anyone's spine. Harold's kindness turned out to be his downfall. It awakened desires in Sarah that no one would dare speak of. And one night, it all came to a deadly end. At dawn, Harold's body was found in his own home, his throat slit, with a barely visible message written in blood. The air was thick with despair, and on the dead man's lips was a disturbing mix of terror and acceptance. It was as if death hadn't come for him, but had been invited. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. A few hours before the crime, she took her prescription meds, the ones she knew would ignite her rage and thirst for blood. At the same time, she gave Harold a sedative, waiting until he drifted off into a sleep he would never wake from. But when she looked at his lifeless body, all she felt was emptiness. According to the prosecutor, the detailed planning and preparation for the crime proved that Sarah wasn't insane, and so she was set to face justice behind bars. During questioning, Sarah admitted she had left her phone and tablet in the kitchen on purpose, making sure she couldn't be tracked. Instead, she stole another phone and used it to call her family from a gas station before fleeing. She packed her belongings, everything she thought she'd need, and drove as far as she could. Eventually, she stopped in a remote area, spending several days sleeping in her car, living on fast food, and plotting her next move. But eventually, guilt started to eat away at her. Sarah felt sick and fell into deep despair. By the time she was found, she was in terrible shape. During questioning, she confessed that she had wanted to see someone die. Law enforcement latched onto this statement, disregarding her claims of being a victim of abuse, and labeled her a psychopath with a desire to kill. Sarah fell into the 7% of confirmed cases uncovered through psychological research. It was believed that the first signs of trouble appeared during her teenage years when she was sexually abused. This trauma triggered the emergence of multiple personalities, one of which was Vanessa, timid and scared, just like Sarah. But the other Alice was her polar opposite, violent, aggressive, always suspicious, and ready to take action to protect the other alter egos. While speaking with psychiatrists in prison, Sarah made another shocking statement. She revealed that the man she killed had actually abused her, despite having set her up in life. He had offered her a good salary, a place to live, and genuinely acted as a mentor. But in return, he demanded sexual favors. Sarah said that over time, she felt trapped. She had initially gone along with his advances to solve her life problems, but instead, she gained new ones that she couldn't handle. She felt he had been using her. During this period, her personalities started to clash. Vanessa wanted to end her own life, while Alice became a full-blown defense mechanism, amplified by a new medication Sarah had been prescribed. This conflict is what drove Sarah to commit the crime. At that moment, Alice took full control of Sarah's body and murdered the man. She slashed his throat brutally, relishing the power she had over her victim. As the execution took place, Sarah's more passive personalities faded into the background, becoming mere observers. It's important to note that while Sarah harbored multiple personalities, only Alice was violent and truly malevolent. According to Sarah, her kinder personalities tried to stop Alice, but they couldn't. Despite this, Sarah's lawyer argued that she should not be imprisoned. The defense claimed that Sarah was not mentally competent and was suffering from severe psychological disorders. In fact, Sarah was unable to attend several court hearings due to the worsening of her mental health. The defense attorney was outraged that Sarah had given a confession during her initial interrogation. According to psychiatrists, it was unclear which of her alter egos was in control of her body at the time. Each of Sarah's personalities told a different story, with only Alice claiming that Harold had abused her, while the others denied it. However, investigators did manage to find evidence of harassment from Harold. He had sent messages to Sarah, hinting at inappropriate behavior. But this was ignored in the investigation. After the shocking crime and during the interrogation, the investigator took another drag of his cigarette and asked, "So Sarah, how did it come to this?" Her gaze grew distant. Her thoughts seemed to unravel, drifting back to a time when things were different. A time without knives, blood, or fear. Several years had passed since it all started. But in her mind, it felt like just yesterday. Let's take a step back and get to know Sarah and Harold. Sarah McLean was born in 1994 in Topeka, the capital of Kansas. She was an ordinary girl, energetic, sociable, and sweet, with long, dark hair. In her childhood, Sarah had a wide range of interests and hobbies. Her parents decided to homeschool her. However, not everything was perfect. A neighbor began to harass her, leaving her with deep psychological trauma. As a teenager, Sarah faced typical adolescent problems, which were worsened by family disputes over property following her parents' divorce. During this time, she was also assaulted by a boy she knew, and the neighbor's harassment continued, causing Sarah to avoid being at home as much as possible. In an attempt to cope, Sarah began drinking and dating various guys, hoping to find love, but it didn't help. She suffered a nervous breakdown and even attempted suicide, which led to her being hospitalized in a psychiatric clinic. After her discharge, Sarah continued taking prescribed medications. Harold Saska was born in 1961. He was a driven man, known for working around the clock. Harold dreamed of building a successful business and becoming wealthy, so he started working at 14. His hard work paid off. After years of managing restaurants, he gained enough money and experience to open his own business. Eventually, he became the owner of 3 franchise pizza shops in Topeka and Lawrence. Harold was well established in the restaurant industry long before he ever met Sarah. Now, let's go back to how it all started, with Sarah and Harold's first meeting, and how an act of kindness turned into something far more brutal. In January 2014, the family of prominent businessman Harold Saska suddenly lost contact with him. As detectives began their investigation, more chilling details about his violent death came to light. It was such a calculated and cold-blooded crime that questions about the fairness of the criminal's punishment continue to spark debates to this day. But what if Harold wasn't the man everyone thought he was? Could it be that behind his outward success lay dark secrets that, in the mind of the killer, justified the crime? This shocking case soon became national news and even inspired a book. At the center of the story was 19-year-old Sarah McLean, sweet, sociable, and seemingly harmless. Shortly before the crime, she had been living with her employer, Harold Saska. His family described him as a successful businessman with a complex personality, quick-tempered, controlling, and prone to dominating his relationships. While Harold could sometimes come off as harsh, none of his loved ones could ever believe he deserved such a gruesome fate. The main characters of this case lived in the quiet town of Lawrence, Kansas, a place where life moved at a slow pace and everyone knew everyone. With a population of fewer than 100,000, the town was far from the chaos of big cities, and such brutality was unheard of. But on January 17, 2014, everything changed when the local police received a call from a teenager who lived near the Lawrence campus. He reported hearing strange and frightening sounds coming from the apartment upstairs. Police were dispatched to investigate. It was already around 11 p.m., and the apartment appeared still. No one answered the door, though the lights inside were on. Officers surveyed the area, looking for a way inside. When they peered through one of the windows, their hearts stopped. A man was lying on the floor, and it was clear he wasn't alive. The officers entered the apartment through the back door and found Harold Saska. His throat had been slashed with such force that it seemed as if his head was barely attached to his neck. There were pools of dried blood everywhere, and the horror of the scene shook even the most seasoned officers. No one could fathom who could commit such a heinous act. The Lawrence police, accustomed to the quiet life of a small town, were suddenly thrust into the midst of the most savage crime they had ever encountered. Detectives soon discovered that at the time of Harold Saska's death, 19-year-old college student Sarah McLean had been living with him. However, there was no trace of her in the house. Initially, there was speculation that Sarah might have been the second victim of an unknown criminal who brutally murdered the businessman and possibly kidnapped her. Sarah was the last person to see Harold alive. But what happened to her afterward remained a mystery. Friends and acquaintances claimed that Harold was not just Sarah's employer. He was a mentor and a role model. She looked to him for support, something she had lacked after the breakdown of her relationship with her biological father. Sarah had always had a strained relationship with her parents, especially after their divorce. When she started college, she moved in with Harold, and despite their significant age difference, they became friends. On the morning that Harold's body was discovered, Sarah's father had already contacted the police to report her missing. This happened well before another student called the police after hearing suspicious noises. Sarah's father told authorities that he regularly spoke to his daughter on the phone, but she hadn't answered any calls in the past 24 hours, which was unlike her. Worried, he decided to report her disappearance. Although police are often slow to respond to such reports, thinking teenagers may have run off due to personal issues or just for fun, this case was different. There was a strong suspicion that Sarah could be the next victim of a violent criminal, making it critical to find her as quickly as possible. Despite Harold's success as a businessman, he was known for his kind and down-to-earth nature, easily getting along with everyone around him. He frequently participated in community events and even gave away free pizza during church services. Harold was also deeply involved in mentoring young people, which is how he met Sarah McLean. She had started working at one of his restaurants in Topeka when she was 14 years old, taking simple orders at the counter. Her hard work didn't go unnoticed. Harold often complimented her, though. At that time, Sarah, still a teenager, chose to ignore his remarks. By the time Sarah was 17, she was desperate to move out of her parents' house. The atmosphere at home was tense, with her parents constantly arguing over the division of property after their divorce, which weighed heavily on Sarah. She began saving money by working at Harold's restaurant, but even with her part-time job, she couldn't save enough to afford her own place. During this period, her relationship with Harold grew closer. She opened up to him about her problems, and he, as part of his mentoring role, became like a second father to her. According to Sarah, her biological father had never shown her much affection. Harold was moved by Sarah's story and offered her a place to stay. He knew she had no other way out and was desperately trying to escape the toxic environment at home. Sarah accepted his offer and soon moved in with him. However, her mother, the only close relative who expressed concern, was wary of the arrangement. She repeatedly voiced her suspicions to Sarah, keeping a close eye on her daughter's movements. But Sarah was determined. She could no longer stand living in a house filled with constant arguments and tension. After Sarah enrolled in college, she moved in with Harold, both seeing it as a temporary solution. They believed it wouldn't last long. Harold wanted to help her by covering her tuition and giving her a place to stay. Over the next few months, they developed a close friendship and became more comfortable with each other. Later, they moved together into a new house in the suburbs, continuing to grow their relationship. But by July 2014, that same house would become the scene of a horrific crime. For investigators, it was unusual for a 19-year-old girl to be living with a 52-year-old man in what was described as a friendly relationship. Initially, detectives assumed that Sarah might have been attacked, just like her mentor. Her parents were extremely worried when she didn't answer their calls, fearing she might have been abducted. If the perpetrator wasn't found quickly, Sarah's fate could be tragic. Forensic experts were shocked by the brutality of the attack on Harold. His hands were tied behind his back, and his throat was slashed. Blood analysis at the scene confirmed that it all belonged to the victim, supporting the theory that Sarah likely wasn't harmed but had been kidnapped. The house showed clear signs of a robbery. Many items were tossed out of drawers as if the intruder had been searching for valuables. They stole cash and a firearm Harold had kept for self-defense. The most puzzling detail for investigators was that nearly all of Sarah's belongings were missing from the house, packed up hastily. However, her car was still in the driveway, and her phone and tablet were left on the kitchen table. This reinforced the detectives' belief that Sarah had been abducted. She wouldn't have left her things, especially her phone and car, behind otherwise. The most mysterious clue was the blood-written letters on the floor. It seemed like some kind of message, but it was so smudged that it couldn't be read. The only other lead was Harold's missing car, which was soon captured on a toll booth camera headed toward Texas. However, the footage was too grainy to identify the driver or even determine their gender. The car was moving south, but no further information from cameras was available. A week passed, but there was no news. Sarah seemed to disappear. However, late in the evening of January 25, 2014, a patrol officer near Glace, Florida, noticed a car parked on the side of the road, parked in an inappropriate place. The officer decided to check it out and discovered a sleeping girl curled up in the back seat. There were numerous empty water bottles in the passenger compartment, indicating that she had probably been living in the car for some time. The patrolman knocked on the window and woke the girl, warning her to leave the place. As a precaution, he checked the license plate number against the database and found that the car was a wanted car belonging to Harold Sasko. The girl was immediately apprehended and sent to Kansas for further investigation. After Sarah was apprehended and the vehicle was seized, a search of the vehicle turned up several weapons, including a large knife, a handgun, and an axe. Forensic investigators determined that it was the knife that was used to take the life of 52-year-old businessman Harold, whose throat was slit. This fact made investigators wonder, what could push the girl, for whom Harold was a mentor and, to some extent, replaced her father, to such a brutal crime? During the interrogation, Sarah said that everything began after she moved in with Harold. In the beginning, their relationship did resemble a father-daughter relationship. The man took care of her, asked her to call him dad in public, and told everyone that Sarah was his stepdaughter to avoid suspicion. However, over time everything changed. Harold began to make indecent proposals to her and gradually moved on to molestation. At first, Sarah tried to avoid these conversations, but Harold became more and more insistent. The man began to demand intimacy, claiming that he had invested in her and now she had to pay back. To increase the pressure, Harold made a list of all his expenses on Sarah, including the plastic surgeries he insisted on to improve her nose and buttocks. He insisted on changes to her appearance, assuring her that it was the only way she would be perfect by his standards. He even wanted her to have her breasts enlarged. Gradually, Harold began to humiliate her, claiming that her real appearance was insufficient and that no one would love her as she was. The girl found herself morally broken. Harold began to drink alcohol and give her illegal substances, and when Sarah was under their influence, he abused her. Over time, she began to give in to his demands and without alcohol, just to avoid making him angry. This constant pressure left Sarah in a victimized state, afraid to leave him and unable to even approach her parents for fear of judgment and shame. As a result, Her mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. She began to avoid work, drank frequently, and spent her days on the couch thinking about how to get out of this hopeless situation. In the end, she saw no other option but to take her own life to free herself from Harold. On that fateful day, January 14th, 2014, when Harold came home and started setting up his speaker system, he asked her to bring him a beer. Sarah added some pre-purchased sleeping pills to the drink. As soon as Harold passed out, she tied his hands to keep him safe. When questioned, she admitted that it was at that moment that she felt in complete control of the situation. Sarah then grabbed a knife and without hesitation plunged it into Harold's neck, cutting his throat. In a state of madness, she tried to cut off his head. At the interrogation, the girl described in detail all the horrifying details of the crime. Despite a brief moment of hesitation, when she wanted to stop, Sarah could no longer stop her actions and decided to finish the job. The police officers were also trying to figure out some of the strange things found at the crime scene. They wanted to understand what the inscription made in blood meant and why it had been erased. The girl eventually explained that she had written the word freedom in blood after committing the crime, but it was accidentally erased. The suspect believed that this was how she was supposed to free herself, and it symbolized the purpose of her crime. After the massacre of Harold was completed, she showered and changed her clothes. On January 17, 2015, Sarah McLean was charged with first-degree murder. The hearing was held in the District Court of the City of Lawrence. On the side of the girl were many witnesses who claimed that she had never shown any propensity for violence or cruelty. However, the prosecution had the opposite opinion. Numerous irrefutable evidences were collected against Sarah. She was found in the victim's car next to a bloody knife with the victim's blood on the blade and the girl's fingerprints on the handle. At the first interrogation, Sarah confessed to the crime and did not recant her testimony even before the start of the trial. Due to the particular brutality of the crime, the prosecutor's office intended to demand a life sentence for the defendant. Sarah's lawyer decided to use a defense strategy based on her mental state, believing that this was a more advantageous approach. He insisted that the girl was insane and in need of treatment. The defense argued that Sarah had mental health issues that she struggled with by taking prescription drugs. However, about a year before the crime, a doctor prescribed a new medication that had a devastating effect on the young student's psyche. She began to have bouts of aggression, periodically went into a rage, and suffered from obsessive thoughts. All this led to the fact that she developed a homicidal mania. For a long time, Sarah tried to cope with the effects of the medication and her disorders, hoping that they would eventually pass. Sarah was sure that once she killed someone, she wouldn't be able to stop. The idea never left her. Sometimes she thought that taking Harold's life would give her new strength, and the thought inspired her. Eventually, she became curious about what it would be like to take someone's life. However, the defense lawyer argued that the crime had been committed under the influence of emotion, impulsively, and that the defendant had been unable to cope with her sudden feelings. The prosecutor insisted that, despite her mental problems, the girl had a clear plan and was aware of her actions. This version was reinforced by the fact that Sarah had been searching for neck wounds, learning how to inflict more effective damage and finding a victim for her crime. On the eve of the crime, Harold had become depressed. He felt depressed and even contemplated taking his own life. Sarah probably decided that she could help her mentor by committing this act on his behalf. The prosecutor argued that the fact that she planned and prepared for the crime belied the defendant's insanity, and therefore she should have been punished. However, the defense also had its own arguments. Defense counsel argued that Sarah was diagnosed with multiple mental disorders, including several alter egos that arose as a consequence of dissociative identity disorder. These states emerged in her as a defense mechanism for the conditions in which she found herself. On this basis, defense counsel insisted on the girl's insanity. A psychiatrist who had worked with Sarah while awaiting trial confirmed that such disorders can develop in young people against the background of traumatic events. The prosecution concluded its case by emphasizing two incontrovertible facts. First, Harold was dead, and second, Sarah was undoubtedly the murderer. Although she tried to portray herself as a victim of circumstance, the real victim was already resting in the grave. The defense insisted that the girl had serious mental problems, and had been intimately abused and molested by the murdered man. During the trial, many members of the jury wondered, how far can a person go when pressured by insanity and fear? When the jury retired for deliberations, Sarah looked more collected than ever. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw the Sasko family. The look of pain and bitterness on their faces was a real blow to her. She couldn't contain her emotions and apologized to them, though she knew that her words couldn't bring back the man she had killed. Fear gripped her when she realized that behind her actions was not only a tragedy, but also the need to take responsibility for her actions. The jury, in reaching their decision, emphasized that this was a premeditated murder, planned with cold calculation. As a result, Sarah was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years. In May 2021, Sarah's case was reviewed and her parole was reduced to 25 years, but this verdict failed to lessen the horror she had caused. Sarah is now serving time at the Topeka Correctional Facility in Topeka, Kansas, and her earliest possibility of being released is in 2039. But will she really be able to leave the prison walls if her inner world remains forever locked in the shadows of what she's done? Every day she spends incarcerated reminds her of what she has lost and what will forever be behind her. A coldness has settled in her heart that never seems to leave her, just like Harold's shadow, which she is no longer able to forget.